The planet had no official name. Not anymore, not for a very long time. Once in the earliest days, when the first human settlers had climbed down from the cargo holds of the three battered transport vessels that had carried them across an ocean of stars they did not yet understand, a woman named Odora had stood on the edge of the plateau with wind pulling at her clothes, and called it something in a language that predated every treaty, every border, every law the council had ever written. She had spoken a word from her mother's tongue, a word that meant the place where the grass sings, and for a brief, fragile moment, the planet had possessed a name that belonged to someone, that belonged to them. But names given by humans to marginal worlds during the Resettlement Accord carried no weight in the corridors of council governance. They were catalogued, translated, filed, and buried under alphanumeric designations that fit neatly into databases maintained by species who had been mapping stars before humanity's earliest ancestors had chipped their first stone tools. Odora's word was recorded in a footnote of a colonial intake survey, misspelled in the transliteration and forgotten within a generation. On council star charts, the world appeared as a single gray dot tagged with a designation that no living being on the planet had ever spoken aloud and that no council official could recall without looking it up. Source vector 7 theta, marginal habitat, human jurisdiction. 7 syllables of bureaucratic indifference, standing in for a world of wind and grass and 47,000 people who had never stopped calling it home. The last inspection had been conducted 212 years ago. The inspector, a Turali diplomat named Valsier, had been dispatched by the Colonial Oversight Subcommittee as part of a routine review of Resettlement Accord worlds, a task that was considered so professionally unrewarding that it was typically assigned to junior diplomats as a form of quiet punishment for unspecified failures. Valsier had drawn the assignment after a poorly received negotiation with the broadened trade delegation, and he had approached it with the enthusiasm of someone filling out tax documentation. He arrived on a standard diplomatic shuttle that was designed for comfort rather than endurance, and the moment its landing struts touched the packed earth of the Outpost's single landing pad, he had regretted every choice that had led him to this moment. The shuttle's climate systems, calibrated for the controlled environments of council stations, struggled against the persistent wind that swept across the plateau. The air smelled of grass and minerals, and something faintly organic that Valsier's translators could not identify and that he did not care to investigate. The buildings visible from the landing pad were constructed from a mixture of local stone, timber, and what appeared to be repurposed hull plating from the original transport vessels, arranged in loose clusters around a central square that was less a square and more an open space where paths converged. Nothing was painted in the standardized colors required by council colonial codes. Nothing met the minimum structural specifications outlined in the resettlement infrastructure guidelines. Nothing, in Valsier's professional assessment, looked like it belonged in a civilization that claimed to have achieved interstellar travel. He spent exactly 4 hours on the surface. He walked through the agricultural stores, nodding without interest at the rows of preserved food and seed containers. He glanced into the medical building, nodding with detached disapproval that it appeared to be a single structure serving the entire population. He spoke briefly with the mayor of the time, a tired-looking man named Heron who answered every question with careful politeness and did not once ask for anything, a fact that Valsier later noted in his report as evidence that the colony had accepted its marginal status with appropriate resignation. He did not visit the northern irrigation system. He did not visit the monitor stations. He did not walk into the grasslands or look at the mountains, or speak to any of the children who watched him from doorways with the particular intensity of young creatures, evaluating a stranger who clearly did not want to be there. He filed his report upon returning to his shuttle, typing it out with the mechanical efficiency of someone completing an unpleasant obligation. The report was 11 paragraphs long. It described the settlement as quaint, irrelevant, and structurally inadequate by any reasonable standard. It noted that the population appeared stable but stagnant. It recommended no action, no follow-up, no further investment. It concluded with a single sentence that would prove to be the most accurate thing ever written about 7 Theta, though not in the way Valsier intended. The colony poses no concern and requires no attention. He was not reprimanded for this report. Nobody cared enough to reprimand him. The Colonial Oversight Subcommittee received it, logged it, and moved on to the next item in a queue of matters that all seemed more pressing than a forgotten human outpost on a world with no strategic value, no significant resources, and no prospects. The report was archived in a database that was itself archived 7 years later during a system consolidation. It would not be read again for over 2 centuries. And the outpost continued. The plateau on which the settlement sat was roughly 40 kilometers across at its widest point. a flat expanse of hard-packed earth and native grasses that rose above the surrounding plains like the palm of an open hand. To the north, mountains ran along the horizon in jagged, weathered silhouettes, their peaks catching the light of the twin suns in ways that shifted with the seasons, sometimes glowing amber and warm, sometimes dark and brooding depending on the angle of the light and the amount of mineral dust in the atmosphere. To the south and east, the plateau dropped away in steep, eroded slopes into the lowland plains, where the tallgrass grew thick and tall, a sea of amber and gold that moved in slow, rolling waves under the constant wind, creating patterns that were never quite the same from one hour to the next. There were two suns. The primary was a steady, warm yellow star that provided the bulk of the light and heat that made the plateau habitable. The secondary was smaller, cooler, and redder, orbiting at a distance that made it appear as a persistent companion to its larger sibling, visible in the sky during most daylight hours as a faint copper disk that added a subtle warmth to the shadows and gave the grasslands their particular amber tone. When both suns were visible simultaneously, which was for most of the daylight cycle, the light on the plateau had a quality that the humans who lived there had never quite been able to describe to anyone outside their world. It was not dramatic or unusual by the standards of Council worlds, many of which orbited binary or trinary systems. But there was something about the specific combination of that particular yellow light and that particular red light falling on that particular grass that created a hue, a warmth, a feeling of illumination that was uniquely 7 theta. It was the kind of light that made old stone glow and made skin feel held. The humans who lived there did not talk about the light the way poets talk about beautiful things. They talked about it the way farmers talk about weather, practically, constantly, with the assumption that everyone around them already understood exactly what they meant because everyone did. It was windy. That was perhaps the single most consistent fact about the planet. The wind came from the north, funneling down through the mountain passes and spreading across the plateau in a steady, persistent flow that rarely stopped and never truly died. It shaped everything. The grass bent permanently southward. The trees, the few that grew in sheltered depressions and along the leeward sides of buildings, leaned at angles that looked almost intentional, as if they had been sculpted rather than grown. The people walked with a slight forward lean on exposed days, a posture so ingrained that visitors, had there been any visitors, would have noticed it as a species-level adaptation, something written into the body by 300 years of wind. The wind carried sound differently than still air did. Conversations were conducted at slightly higher volumes than they would have been elsewhere, not because people were shouting, but because they had learned without thinking about it to project their voices into the wind's current rather than against it. The wind also carried scent with extraordinary efficiency. A cooking fire on the south side of the settlement could be smelled on the north side within minutes. The mineral tang of a storm building in the mountains could be detected a full day before it arrived. And the grass, always the grass, contributed a constant bass note to the olfactory landscape, a dry, sweet, faintly herbal smell that saturated everything on the plateau so completely that the humans who lived there no longer noticed it, the way you stop noticing the smell of your own home. It was quiet, that was the other thing, not silent. The wind ensured it was never truly silent, but quiet in a way that was deeper than the absence of noise, a quiet that came from distance, from isolation, from the simple geographical fact that there was nothing nearby making sound. No ground traffic, no industrial facilities, no atmospheric craft, no orbital shuttles coming and going, no relay station humming with subspace transmissions. Just the wind, the grass, the distant lowing of the herd animals the humans kept for milk and wool, and the small, intimate sounds of people living their lives in close proximity to one another. Footsteps on stone, the clatter of tools, children's voices carrying from the school building, the creak of a door, a laugh from a neighboring yard. Sounds that existed on a human scale, unamplified, uncompeted for, unremarkable, and therefore all the more remarkable for their persistence across 3 centuries of a universe that was, in most places, very loud indeed. At the time of its founding, the Outpost had been home to 14,000 humans. They had come as part of the Resettlement Accord, one of dozens of species shuffled to marginal worlds after the Fracture Wars, a conflict so vast and so destructive that even its name had become a kind of shorthand for catastrophe, the way certain words in certain languages are never spoken aloud because the thing they describe is too terrible to approach directly. The Fracture Wars had lasted 40 years and had shattered the old interstellar order, redrawn borders, displaced billions, and left a legacy of trauma and bureaucratic chaos that the Council, newly reformed in the war's aftermath, had spent the next century trying to manage with varying degrees of competence and sincerity. The Resettlement Accord was one of the Council's earliest and most ambitious attempts to deal with the displaced populations. Under its terms, species that had lost their homeworlds or been driven from contested territories were offered new homes on worlds designated as marginal, meaning they were habitable but not desirable, possessing breathable atmospheres and tolerable gravity but lacking in significant mineral resources, strategic location, or aesthetic appeal. The worlds were given to the displaced peoples not as gifts but as assignments, allocated through a process that was described in council documents as equitable distribution, and described by the displaced peoples themselves in terms that were considerably less diplomatic. Humans had been among the displaced. Their homeworld, Earth, had not been destroyed in the Fracture Wars, a fact that was often misunderstood by other species who assumed that any species relocated under the Accord must have lost everything. Earth still existed. It still held a human population. But it had been on the losing side of a political alignment during the wars, and the terms of the peace settlement had included a forced reduction of Earth's population and the dispersal of human communities across Council space as a security measure. This was not called exile in Council documents. It was called strategic population redistribution. The humans who were loaded onto transport vessels and sent to worlds they had never heard of, worlds that had been selected by algorithms they did not understand and approved by committees they could not address, experienced it as exile regardless of what the documents called it. 3 transport vessels carried 14,000 humans to 7 Theta. The journey took 11 months. The ships were not designed for passenger comfort. They were cargo vessels retrofitted with basic life support and sleeping bays, the kind of ships used to move equipment and supplies between established stations, not to carry living beings across interstellar distances. People slept in shifts because there were not enough bays for everyone to lie down at once. Food was functional and monotonous. Water was strictly rationed. The ship's internal lighting ran on a fixed cycle that did not match any natural day-night rhythm, and after the first few weeks, many of the passengers lost track of time entirely, existing in a state of suspended animation that was not sleep and not waking but something in between, a gray, featureless waiting that stretched from one indistinguishable day to the next. Children were born during the journey, 3 of them. They entered the universe in the cargo hold of a ship that smelled of recycled air and machine oil, surrounded by people who were exhausted and frightened and trying very hard not to show it, and they were welcomed with a quiet ferocity that surprised even the parents themselves, a fierceness that said, without words, we are still here and you are ours and that matters. When the ships finally descended through 7 Theta's atmosphere and touched down on the plateau, the passengers emerged into a world that was nothing like what any of them had imagined. Those who had come from Earth or from Earth-descended colonies had carried with them mental images of what a planet should look like, images shaped by forests and oceans and skies of particular blues. 7 Theta offered none of these things. It offered wind and grass and twin suns and mountains, and an enormous, indifferent silence that felt less like peace and more like the absence of anything else. Some of them wept, not from sorrow, though there was sorrow, but from the sheer accumulated weight of 11 months of gray existence suddenly giving way to something so vast and so foreign that the body did not know how to process it. They stood on the edge of the plateau with the wind pulling at their clothes and the amber grass stretching to the horizon, and they wept because they had arrived. And arriving meant that the journey was over, and the journey being over meant that whatever came next was now real in a way that it had not been before. Odora, the woman who gave the planet its first and only human name, was among those who stood at the edge that day. She was not a leader. She was a former agricultural technician from a colony on the outer rim of human space, a woman in her middle years with strong hands and a practical mind who had been assigned to the transport vessels because her skills were deemed useful for establishing food production on marginal worlds. She was not the type to make speeches or issue declarations. But when she looked out at the grasslands moving in the wind, she said the word the word from her mother's tongue, and the people around her heard it and understood it not as a name but as a statement of intent. This is where the grass sings. This is where we are. This is where we will be. They began building that same day. Most of the species relocated under the resettlement accord either died out, were relocated again, or quietly integrated into council space over the following decades. The mortality rate for marginal colonies in the first 50 years after the accord was staggering, a fact that the council acknowledged in internal reports but did not publicize, because publicizing it would have required acknowledging that the accord had been, in many cases, a death sentence dressed in bureaucratic language. Colonies failed for many reasons: inadequate supplies, incompatible biology, psychological collapse, conflict between displaced groups placed on shared worlds without adequate mediation. The simple, grinding, relentless difficulty of building a civilization from nothing on a world that had been deemed not worth building on. The humans on 7 Theta did none of the things that other colonies did. They did not die out. They did not request relocation. They did not integrate into council space. They simply stayed. They stayed and they built and they adapted and they endured, not through any special quality that they would have claimed for themselves, but through the accumulated momentum of people who had decided, individually and collectively, that giving up was not an option they were willing to exercise. The first years were brutal. There was no infrastructure beyond what the transport vessels could provide, and the vessels themselves were designed to be disassembled for parts. A feature that the Council had included in the specifications precisely because it was assumed that relocated populations would need to cannibalize their ships to survive. The humans did this with methodical efficiency, stripping the vessels of every usable component, every panel, every wire, every pipe, every bolt, and organizing the salvaged materials into categories that reflected a practical understanding of what would be needed most. Hull plating for walls and roofing, insulation material from the life support systems, wiring for electrical systems, metal framing for structural supports. Engine components that could be adapted for power generation or water pumping or mechanical systems that nobody had designed yet, but that someone would need to design soon because the problems were already arriving faster than the solutions. Water was the first crisis. The plateau had no surface water in sufficient quantity to support 14,000 people. There were underground aquifers, detected by the transport vessel's survey equipment during the approach, but accessing them required drilling equipment that the humans did not have in sufficient quantity and drilling expertise that they had to develop on the spot through trial, error, and a willingness to fail repeatedly that would become one of the defining characteristics of the Outpost's engineering tradition. The first well took 3 months to complete. It produced water that was mineral-heavy and slightly discolored and tasted, according to one of the early settlers, like the inside of a rock. But it was water, and it flowed. And 14,000 people drank it and did not complain because complaining about the taste of water implied that there was an alternative, and there was not. Food was the second crisis. The seed stock that had been provided under the Accord was minimal, a basic agricultural starter kit designed for temperate zone cultivation on Earth-standard worlds, which 7 Theta was not. The growing season was longer than Earth's, which was advantageous, but the soil chemistry was different, the light spectrum from the twin suns was different, and the wind presented challenges that no Earth-descended farming tradition had ever had to address. Crops failed. Not all of them, and not always, but enough to cause genuine fear in the early years. The kind of fear that sits in the stomach alongside hunger and whispers that this might be the time it all falls apart. The agricultural technicians, Odora among them, worked relentless hours adapting cultivation methods, developing new planting patterns that accounted for wind exposure, experimenting with soil amendments using locally available minerals, and slowly, painfully, building a food system that could sustain the population. They lost people in those early years, not many by the standards of marginal colonies, but enough. Children mostly, the very old, people whose bodies were already weakened by the journey and could not withstand the additional stresses of a new world. Each death was a specific particular grief, a person with a name and a face and a history that ended on this windy plateau far from anywhere they had ever wanted to be. The community buried them in a small plot on the eastern edge of the settlement, marking each grave with a stone carried from the mountains. There were no ceremonies in the early years, or rather the ceremonies were so simple and so private that they would not have been recognized as ceremonies by an outside observer. A gathering of a few people, a moment of silence, a stone placed on a grave, a return to work because work was the only thing that kept the next death from coming. Over the decades, the dying slowed and then nearly stopped. Not because the world became easier. It never became easy, but because the humans became better at living on it. Each generation inherited knowledge that the previous generation had earned through hard experience, and each generation added to that knowledge, building layers of understanding and capability that, over time, transformed the Outpost from a precarious cluster of survivors into a stable, self-sustaining community. The population grew, not through any particular boom or surge, but through the steady, unhurried accumulation of births over deaths that characterizes any community that has achieved basic food security and public health. 14,000 became 20,000, 20 became 30, 30 became 40. By the 300-year mark, the population stood at roughly 47,000, a number that reflected not growth as ambition, but growth as the natural consequence of people continuing to live and have children in a place where living and having children were possible. They had asked for help once. In the early years, when the memory of Earth was still fresh enough to ache, and the assumption that the Council would eventually provide what was needed had not yet been extinguished by experience. A carefully worded petition had been drafted by the settlement's first formal governing body, a council of 7 elders who had been chosen not through election, but through the quiet consensus that sometimes emerges in small communities when people are too busy surviving to engage in politics. The petition requested agricultural equipment upgrades, Specifically, a set of advanced cultivation tools that had been listed in the original resettlement Accord documentation as standard provisions for marginal colonies, but that had never arrived on 7 Theta. The petition was written in formal council standard, translated 3 times to ensure accuracy, and submitted through proper channels, which in this case meant handing it to the automated supply drone that visited once per cycle and trusting that it would eventually reach someone who could read it and care. It took 11 months for a response to arrive. 11 months during which the petition's authors continued to develop their own tools, because waiting for a response did not mean waiting to act. When the response finally came, it was a single printed sheet, standard council form, with the relevant fields filled in by what appeared to be a low-level clerk who had not read the petition in any detail. The response informed the settlers that their request had been logged and reviewed under standard marginal colony protocols, and that no further action was warranted at this time. It was signed with a mechanical stamp that did not include a name. Nothing came of it. They did not petition again. This was not, as some later commentators would suggest, an act of bitterness or resentment. It was an act of pragmatism. The energy required to draft a petition, submit it, wait for a response, and then process the disappointment of that response could be spent on building a better irrigation pump or developing a more resilient seed strain or repairing a roof before the next storm. The calculus was simple, and it was never verbalized because it did not need to be. Every adult on the outpost understood it implicitly. The council was not coming. Whatever they had, they would have to make themselves. Whatever they needed, they would have to provide for themselves. Whatever broke, they would have to fix. This was not a philosophy. It was not a political stance. It was not a declaration of independence or an act of defiance. It was arithmetic. The energy spent asking for help was energy not spent staying alive, and staying alive was the only project that mattered. So they rebuilt their water pumps using salvaged parts from the original landing craft. They developed seed strains that could survive the longer growing season and the mineral storms that swept down from the northern mountains with irregular but inevitable frequency. Storms that deposited fine metallic dust across the plateau and could kill unprotected crops within hours. They constructed wind turbines from locally sourced metals, crude by council standards but functional, generating enough electricity to power basic lighting, communication equipment, and the small medical facility that served the entire population. Their homes were stone and timber, and recycled hull plating sturdy structures that had been designed not by architects, but by people who understood wind and rain, and the specific kinds of failure that buildings on this plateau were susceptible to. Understanding born from watching buildings fail and learning from those failures, and building the next one better. The medical facility was a single building, large enough to house perhaps 30 patients at capacity, staffed by 3 people who had been trained by their predecessors, who had been trained by theirs in an unbroken chain of practical knowledge passed down like family recipes. There was no advanced medical equipment, no scanning technology, no pharmaceutical manufacturing. What they had was knowledge, carefully preserved and transmitted across generations, covering everything from basic surgery to childbirth to the treatment of injuries and illnesses specific to life on 7 Theta. The medical staff could not cure everything. They could not replace organs or repair genetic damage or treat the kinds of complex conditions that council medical facilities handled routinely. But they could set bones, suture wounds, manage infections with locally produced antiseptics, deliver bobbies safely, and provide palliative care for the dying. They did this with competence and compassion and without apology for what they could not do, because apologizing for limitations that could not be overcome was another waste of energy they could not afford. The outpost had no military. This was not a policy decision or a philosophical stance. It was a consequence of having no weapons, no training facilities, and no threat that required a military response. The planet was too remote to be strategically valuable and too poor in resources to be worth conquering. No hostile force had ever approached 7 Theta. No hostile force ever would, at least not for the reasons that typically drove conflict in council space. The humans on the plateau did not fear invasion any more than a person living in a deep desert fears pirate attacks. The concern simply did not apply to their situation. They had no starships. The 3 transport vessels had been completely disassembled within the first decade. Their engines had been adapted for power generation. Their hulls had become walls and roofs. Their navigation systems, rendered useless by the lack of any destination to navigate to, had been dismantled for components. No human on 7 Theta had ever piloted a spacecraft. No human on 7 Theta had ever left the planet's surface. The sky above them was traversed by the monthly supply drone and, very occasionally, by the distant lights of ships passing through the system on routes that connected actual places to other actual places. Ships that were so far away and moving so fast that they appeared as brief streaks of light, there and gone, like meteors that happened to be traveling in straight lines. The humans watched these streaks sometimes, standing in the dark outside their homes, and felt about them the way a person standing on a remote shoreline feels about the lights of a distant ship on the horizon. A vague awareness that other people existed in the universe, going to other places, doing other things. A feeling that was not quite loneliness and not quite envy, but something in between, something that did not have a name because it was not the kind of feeling that came up often enough to require one. They had no representation on the council floor. Humanity as a species had council representation technically through a designated diplomatic post that rotated among the major human-settled worlds. But the human diplomat who sat in that post, whoever they happened to be at any given time, did not represent 7 Theta. They did not speak for the outpost, advocate for its needs, or even mention its existence in council proceedings. They were not aware of its existence. The outpost had not been included in the human diplomatic portfolio because it had been classified as a marginal habitat under direct council jurisdiction, a designation that meant it fell through the cracks between human governance and council governance and belonged fully to neither. It was a geopolitical orphan, a population without a patron, a world without an advocate, existing in a space that no institution claimed and no institution felt responsible for. When the council debated resource allocation, the name 7 Theta was never spoken aloud. When the council discussed humanitarian concerns, the outpost was not mentioned. When the council reviewed colonial governance, the settlement was skipped over, its file so thin and so unremarkable that it literally slipped between the cracks of the review process, missed by automated systems that were programmed to flag colonies with populations above 50,000 and by manual reviewers who were looking for problems, and saw nothing in the 7 Theta file that registered as a problem because the file contained almost no information at all. It existed in databases the way dust exists in an attic, present but permanently overlooked, accumulating slowly, silently, in layers so thin that they were invisible unless you knew to look for them, and nobody knew to look for them because nobody had any reason to. The supply drone arrived once per cycle. It had been doing this for 300 years. The drone was an automated vessel of a design that had been obsolete before the outpost was founded, a small, boxy craft with minimal propulsion and no defensive capabilities, programmed to follow a single route from the nearest relay station to 7 Theta and back again. It carried no cargo on the outbound leg. Its purpose was to deliver data cylinders, small containers of information that constituted the outpost's only regular connection to the larger galaxy, and to collect any outgoing data that the settlers wished to transmit. The data cylinders that arrived were almost always empty of anything meaningful. They contained routine council broadcasts, agricultural advisories that were written for temperate zone Earth standard worlds, and were therefore useless on 7 Theta, public safety announcements about hazards that did not exist on the plateau, and occasional updates to colonial regulations that the outpost had no capacity to implement and no obligation to follow, since nobody was checking. Once every few years, a cylinder would contain something marginally relevant, a revised star chart or an update to communication protocols, and the outpost communication technician would file it away with the quiet diligence of a librarian cataloging books that would never be checked out. The drone itself was aging. It had been designed for a service life of 20 years and had been operating for 300. This was possible only because of the outpost technicians, who had over the decades developed an intimate understanding of the drone systems and had repaired and replaced its components so many times that virtually nothing of the original vessel remained except the hull frame. When the drone landed on the pad, it was met by a technician who would perform a routine inspection, replace any components showing wear, and send it on its way. This had become a ceremonial duty of sorts, passed from one generation of technicians to the next, a small ritual of maintenance that connected the outpost to the larger galaxy even when the galaxy had nothing to say to them. The landing pad itself had not been repainted in a century. The original markings, which had once indicated landing zones and safety perimeters in the standardized colors required by Council aviation codes, had faded to ghostly suggestions of their former selves, the paint worn away by wind and weather and the slow, indifferent erosion of time. The pad was still functional. The drone could still find it using its navigation systems. But it looked like what it was: a piece of infrastructure maintained at the minimum level required for function, with no resources spared for appearance or comfort or any quality that could not be directly justified by necessity. This was the aesthetic of the entire outpost. Everything was maintained, nothing was decorated, buildings were sound but unadorned, paths were clear but unpaved. The central square, the open space where the main paths converged, was simply a flat area of packed earth with no fountain, no statue, no monument, no marker of any kind to indicate that this was the heart of a community of 47,000 people. It was a place where people gathered because it was the most convenient place to gather, not because it had been designed to inspire or impress. This was not austerity. It was not minimalism. It It was not a cultural preference for simplicity, though some outsiders, had there been any outsiders, might have interpreted it that way. It was the result of 300 years of making choices about resource allocation in an environment where every resource had to be earned, produced, or salvaged, and where the question, "Do we need this?" was asked before every expenditure of time, material, or energy, and the answer was almost always no. The things that were maintained impeccably. The water systems, the power generation, the medical facility, the food stores, the monitor network. These were the things that kept people alive, and they received the full measure of the community's attention and resources. Everything else was left to weather and time and the slow, patient work of entropy, which the humans of 7 Theta understood better than most species because they lived with it every day, watching the wind and the storms and the mineral dust gradually wearing down everything they built, knowing that the work of maintenance was never finished and that the moment you stopped, the world would start taking things back. Mayor Adebio Chen was the 63rd person to hold the title. The position of mayor on 7 Theta was not elected through any process that the council would recognize or approve of. There were no campaigns, no political parties, no ballots, no term limits, no formal power structures governing the transfer of authority. The position existed because the community needed someone to handle certain tasks that were best handled by a single designated person rather than by committee. Tasks like representing the outpost in communications with the outside world, coordinating large-scale resource allocation decisions, and serving as a point of contact in emergencies. The mayor did not have legislative power. They did not have the authority to issue commands or impose decisions on the community. They were, in the most literal sense, a coordinator, a person who kept track of what needed to be done and made sure that the right people were talking to each other about how to do it. When a new mayor was needed, the community gathered and discussed it until a consensus emerged. This could take hours or days depending on the complexity of the situation, but it always eventually produced a result, because the community understood that the position needed to be filled and that prolonged indecision was, like everything else on 7 Theta, a waste of energy. The person who emerged from this process was typically someone who had been quietly doing the job already, someone who possessed the particular combination of practical competence, steady temperament, and institutional knowledge that the role required, and who was willing to take on the formal responsibilities without allowing those responsibilities to change who they were. Adebio had been managing the water systems for 19 years when the previous mayor, a woman named Sable, had decided to step down. Sable was 73 years old and had served as mayor for 11 years, during which time she had guided the community through a particularly severe drought cycle and a structural failure in the eastern water main that had required the coordination of over 200 workers across 3 weeks of continuous labor. She was widely respected, not because she was charismatic or inspiring, but because she was reliable and clear-headed and never asked anyone to do anything she was not willing to do herself, qualities that on 7 Theta counted for more than any amount of oratorical skill. When Sable announced that she wished to step down, explaining that she wanted to spend her remaining years teaching children how to identify edible fungi in the grasslands, a pursuit she had maintained as a personal passion throughout her tenure, the community gathered in the central square and discussed the matter. Several names were raised. Adebio's was among them, put forward by one of the water system technicians who pointed out, with the straightforwardness that characterized all discourse on 7 Theta, that Adebio already spent most of his time solving coordination problems that were technically the mayor's responsibility, and that making it official would simply reduce the amount of time he wasted explaining to people why he was doing things that were not technically his job. No one argued with this. Adebio was asked if he would accept. He considered the question for approximately 10 seconds, during which he thought about the water systems, which were due for their semi-annual inspection in 2 weeks and which would require someone competent to oversee them, whether or not that someone was also the mayor. He accepted the way someone accepts whether it was happening, he would deal with it. He was 51 years old, with deep brown skin that had been weathered by decades of outdoor work into a texture that told stories if you knew how to read them. Stories about sun exposure and wind burn and mineral dust, and the particular kind of minor abrasions that came from working with tools and machinery in environments where protective equipment was available, but always in short supply. His hair was close-cropped and gray at the temples, a genetic inheritance from his father that had appeared earlier than expected and that he had never bothered to think about. His eyes were dark and steady, set in a face that was not handsome or striking but that possessed a quality that was more useful than either. It was a face that inspired confidence, not through any dramatic expression of strength or intelligence, but through the simple absence of anything that suggested dishonesty, instability, or pretense. When Adebio looked at you, you felt that he was seeing you clearly and that he had no interest in seeing anything other than what was actually there. His hands were permanently calloused from 3 decades of mechanical work. The calluses were not rough or uncomfortable in the way that people who did not work with their hands imagined calluses to be. They were smooth, hardened layers of skin that had built up over years of gripping tools, turning bolts, hauling pipes, and digging trenches, and they served a practical function, allowing Adebio to handle hot components, rough materials, and sharp edges without discomfort or injury. He was proud of his hands in a way that he never expressed verbally because there was no one to express it to who would not already understand. On 7 Theta, everyone's hands told the same kind of story. The details varied, the specific calluses and scars and worn patches corresponding to different trades and different histories, but the underlying narrative was universal. These are the hands of someone who builds and fixes things, who has spent a lifetime turning effort into function, who has earned every line and mark through work that was necessary, and that was done without expectation of recognition. He did not think of himself as a leader. He thought of himself as a person who kept things running, which was more or less what every adult on 7 Theta thought of themselves. The farmer who tended the fields thought of herself as someone who kept food growing. The technician who maintained the power systems thought of himself as someone who kept the lights on. The medical worker who treated the sick thought of herself as someone who kept people alive. Everyone had a function. Everyone understood their function. Everyone performed their function with the quiet, sustained dedication that came from knowing that the function was real and necessary, and that its continuation depended entirely on their willingness to continue performing it. Adebio's function had simply expanded, as functions on 7 Theta sometimes did when the community's needs shifted, and someone with the right combination of skills and temperament was available to fill the gap. He still oversaw the water systems. He still spent time in trenches and pump houses, working alongside the technicians who actually maintained the infrastructure. Because stepping away from the hands-on work would have meant losing the practical knowledge that made him effective at the coordination work, and losing practical knowledge on 7 Theta was, in a very real sense, a form of failure. He had a wife named Essa and 2 adult children, a son who worked in the agricultural stores and a daughter who was one of the 3 medical staff. His family life was ordinary by the standards of the Outpost, which is to say that it was rich in the particular qualities that matter when material wealth is absent. Mutual respect, shared labor, quiet affection, and the deep, unspoken understanding that each person in the family was doing their best in a world that did not make doing your best easy. Essa was a weaver, one of the community's most skilled, producing textiles from the wool of the herd animals that were used for clothing, blankets, and trade within the settlement. She was a quiet woman with a dry humor that surfaced unexpectedly and that Adebio had never fully learned to anticipate, even after 26 years of marriage. She did not involve herself in the coordination work of the mayor's office, not because she lacked interest, but because she understood, with the clarity that characterized all of her thinking, that the outpost functioned best when people focused on what they were good at. And what she was good at was making things with her hands, while Adebio made things happen with his judgments. They lived in a stone house on the southern edge of the settlement, where the wind was partially blocked by a low ridge and the view of the grasslands was unobstructed. The house had been built by Adebio's grandfather and had been expanded and modified by each subsequent generation, acquiring rooms and features in an organic, unplanned process that reflected the changing needs of the family rather than any architectural vision. It was comfortable but not decorative. The walls were bare stone. The furniture was functional. The only objects that could be described as ornamental were a series of small carved figures that Essa's mother had made, arranged on a shelf above the fireplace, depicting scenes from the outpost's history that were recognizable to anyone who had grown up hearing the stories. A figure bending over a well, a figure standing in a field of tallgrass, a figure holding a child. Small, simple, carved from local stone with tools that were not designed for fine work, but possessing a quality of attention and care that made them, to anyone who knew their origin, more valuable than anything the council's artisan guilds could have produced. On the morning everything changed, Adebio was knee-deep in a drainage trench behind the northern irrigation hub, clearing a blockage of mineral sediment that had built up over the dry season. The sediment was a fine, dense, reddish-gray material that accumulated in the drainage channels during periods of low water flow, compacting into a mass that was almost as hard as concrete, and that had to be broken up manually with chisels and hand tools before it could be scooped out and carried away. It was tedious, physically demanding work that required sustained attention to avoid damaging the channel walls, which were lined with stone that had been laid by hand 2 generations ago, and that would be difficult and time-consuming to replace if cracked. Adebio had been at it since dawn. The twin suns had risen in the east, the smaller red one appearing first as a dim copper disk above the grasslands, followed by the larger yellow one which quickly dominated the sky with its warmth and light. The wind was moderate, coming from the north in steady gusts that carried the smell of the grasslands and the faint mineral tang of the mountains. His shirt was soaked with sweat and smeared with sediment. His hands, even with their thick calluses, were beginning to feel the strain of 3 hours of continuous chisel work. He was thinking about lunch, specifically about the dried meat and root vegetable wrap that Essa had packed for him that morning and that was sitting in his bag on the edge of the trench, and about whether he could justify stopping a few minutes early to eat it when his comm unit crackled. The comm unit was a battered device, roughly the size and shape of a closed fist, held together with wire and stubbornness and a kind of mechanical tenacity that bordered on the miraculous. It had been assembled from salvaged components over a decade ago by one of the Outpost communication technicians and had been maintained in working condition ever since through the same process of continuous repair and replacement that characterized all technology on 7 Theta. Its casing was scarred and dented. Its antenna was a piece of stiff wire that had been bent and straightened so many times that it had developed a permanent slight curve, like a tree that had grown in strong wind. Its battery was a hand-built rechargeable unit that held barely enough charge for a full day of use, and that had to be cycled through a solar charger every evening to maintain even that modest capacity. The sound it made was not the scheduled monthly drone ping. Adebio knew the drone ping the way he knew his own heartbeat, a steady, predictable signal that arrived like clockwork once per cycle and that he had heard so many times that it had become background noise as unremarkable as the wind. This sound was different. It was sharper, more insistent, carrying a frequency and a rhythm that the comm unit had never produced before in Adebio's experience. It was not a notification tone. It was not a maintenance alert, it was something else entirely. Adebio stopped chiseling. He stood still in the trench, the sediment-heavy water lapping against his knees, and looked at the device where it sat on the edge of the channel, crackling with a sound that seemed almost alive in its urgency. He wiped the mud from his hands on his shirt, leaving long streaks of reddish-gray across the already ruined fabric, and picked up the device with a care that was disproportionate to its physical condition, holding it as if it were something fragile and important, which at that moment it was. The signal was repeating on a frequency he had only read about in the Outpost's ancient technical manuals, the crumbling, water-stained documents that had been brought down from the original transport vessels and preserved in the town hall's archive with a reverence that the manuals themselves, being instruction manuals for obsolete equipment, did not strictly deserve. Emergency broadcast, Galactic tier. The designation was explicit in the signal's encoding, a standardized header that had been established by the Council in the aftermath of the Fracture Wars as a universal alert system, a way of reaching every receiver in known space simultaneously when the situation was sufficiently dire to warrant it. Adebio had read about Galactic tier emergency broadcasts in the technical manuals. He had never expected to hear one. The manuals described the system in dry technical language, explaining the frequency protocols, the encoding standards, the relay routing procedures, but they did not describe what it would feel like to actually receive one. Because the people who wrote the manuals had assumed reasonably that anyone reading them would already know what it felt like, or would find out soon enough, or would never need to know. Adebio, reading the manuals as a young technician studying the Outpost communication systems, had filed the information away as abstract knowledge, the kind of thing that was interesting to know, but that had no practical application in a life spent maintaining drainage trenches and water pumps on a forgotten plateau. He pressed the receive button with a muddy thumb. A voice emerged from the device's small, scratchy speaker. It was speaking in formal council standard, the kind of standardized, accent-neutral pronunciation that was used in official broadcasts to ensure comprehensibility across species and linguistic traditions. The voice belonged to no specific individual. It was a synthesized broadcast, generated by the Council's emergency communication system and transmitted through every functioning relay in the network. But the words it spoke, and the tone in which they were delivered, carried a weight that transcended the artificiality of their origin. The voice was calm. That was the most striking thing about it. Calm in a way that was clearly intentional, clearly designed to convey authority and control in a situation where authority and control were the very things most at risk of being lost. Calm in a way that, paradoxically, made the content of the message more frightening, because the need for that kind of calm implied a level of crisis that ordinary calm could not address. The message was not addressed to him, it was addressed to everyone, and it said very simply that something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong and it was spreading and nobody knew how to stop it. Adebio stood in the trench for a long time, the muddy water soaking into his clothes, the wind pulling at his hair, the twin suns warming his back while the cold water chilled his legs, and he listened to the message repeat. He listened to it 3 times in full, and then he listened to it a 4th time, more carefully, trying to extract specific details from the formal language, trying to understand not just what was being said but what was not being said, what was hiding in the spaces between the carefully chosen words and the measured syllables. The message did not provide details. It was not designed to. Its purpose was to alert, not to inform. It told the listeners that a subspace anomaly had been detected, that it was expanding, that it was affecting relay networks and FTL travel, and that the Council was convening an emergency response. It instructed all recipients to maintain communication readiness and to submit any relevant data through standard channels. It ended with a repeated designation code that confirmed its authenticity, and a standard closure phrase that Adebyo had never heard spoken aloud before, but that he recognized from the technical manuals as the formal designation for a galaxy-wide emergency. When the message finished its fourth repetition, the comm unit went silent. The wind filled the silence. The water in the trench lapped gently against the channel walls. Somewhere behind him, a bird called out, a native species with a three-note call that the humans of the outpost had long ago nicknamed the question bird because its call sounded to human ears like someone asking the same thing over and over. The amber grass beyond the irrigation hub moved in slow waves under the twin suns, the same way it had moved for 300 years, the same way it would move tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, regardless of what was happening in the vast spaces between the stars. Adebyo looked at the comm unit in his hand. Then he looked at the trench around him, the sediment he had been clearing, the stone walls that generations of technicians had laid and maintained, the simple, functional infrastructure that kept 47,000 people alive on a windy plateau that the galaxy had forgotten. He thought about the message and what it meant and what it would require, and he felt something move inside him that was not fear and not excitement and not determination, but something that contained elements of all three, a feeling that he had no name for because he had never needed it before. He climbed out of the trench. Water and mud poured off his legs as he hauled himself over the edge, leaving dark smears on the stones. He stood on solid ground and looked south toward the settlement, the cluster of stone and timber buildings that spread across the plateau in their familiar, unremarkable pattern, and he started walking. His bag with the lunch wrap was still sitting on the edge of the trench. He did not go back for it. Essa would understand. Essa always understood. The wind was at his back, pushing him toward the town hall, and the grasslands stretched out on either side of the path, amber and gold under the twin suns, and somewhere far away beyond the mountains, beyond the relay networks, beyond the reach of anything the people of this plateau had ever built or known, something was spreading through the fabric of space itself, erasing the connections that held a galaxy together. And Adebyo Chen, 63rd mayor of a forgotten outpost on a world with no name, walked toward the center of town with mud on his clothes and a galactic emergency echoing in his hand, preparing to tell 47,000 people that the universe, which had ignored them for 3 centuries, had finally come looking for what they had. He did not know yet what that was, but he suspected, with the quiet certainty of a man who had spent his life keeping things running, that it would matter. That 300 years of watching and building and maintaining and surviving had accumulated into something that the galaxy, in its arrogance and its speed and its endless noisy expansion, had overlooked but could not afford to lose. He walked, the wind pushed, the grass sang. And the forgotten rock waited, as it had always waited, with the patience of a thing that had never needed to be noticed to continue being important. It took 11 days for the full scope of the crisis to reach the outpost's ancient communication array. 11 days. That alone told Adebyo more about the severity of the situation than any of the words in the emergency broadcast. Under normal circumstances, a galactic-tier emergency message would be followed within hours by detailed briefings transmitted through the relay network, cascading from council headquarters to regional hubs to local receivers in a carefully choreographed flow of information designed to keep every affected population informed and, more importantly, calm. The system had been designed in the aftermath of the Fracture Wars precisely because the council had learned at enormous cost that information vacuums in crisis situations killed people faster than the crises themselves. Panic, misinformation, paralysis, irrational decision-making, these were the enemies that rushed in to fill the space where clear communication should have been, and the emergency broadcast protocol existed to prevent that space from ever opening. But the briefings did not come, not that day, not the next, not the day after that. The comm unit sat on the shelf in Adebyo's office, silent except for the faint background hiss of an open channel that connected to nothing, and the days passed, and each passing day was itself a message, a silence that communicated more eloquently than any words could have done. The relay network was failing. Adebyo understood this before he had any confirmation of it, because understanding it did not require technical knowledge or access to classified information. It required only the understanding of a man who had spent his life maintaining systems and who recognized, with the instinctive certainty of long experience, the particular quality of silence that meant a system was not functioning rather than merely being quiet. A sleeping system has a rhythm. A broken system has an absence. The communication array on 7 Theta, crude and ancient as it was, had a rhythm. It hummed. It ticked. It produced faint electronic whispers as it monitored frequencies and scanned for incoming signals, a continuous low-level activity that was so constant and so familiar that the human technicians who maintained it had long ago stopped hearing it consciously, the way you stop hearing the sound of your own breathing. But when Adebio stood in the communication building on the evening of the first day and listened, really listened, he noticed that the rhythm was wrong. Not absent, but diminished. The range of frequencies the array could detect had narrowed. Signals that should have been there, the background chatter of a functioning relay network carrying traffic between star systems, were simply gone, replaced by a silence that was not empty but full. Like the silence in a room where someone has just stopped speaking and the echo of their last word has not yet faded. By the third day, the silence had deepened. By the fifth, the array could detect signals on only a handful of frequencies, and those signals were degraded, fragmented, ghostly transmissions that arrived in pieces and could not be fully reconstructed. By the seventh day, even the emergency broadcast frequency had gone silent, the synthesized voice that had announced the crisis now itself swallowed by whatever was consuming the network, leaving the outpost with nothing but the wind and the grass and the slow, terrible accumulation of unanswered questions. The information that did arrive came in fragments, carried by relay drones that were themselves running low on power because the relay network they depended on was failing. The drones were automated vessels programmed to follow routes between relay stations, and as the stations went dark, the drones that passed through the affected regions lost their navigation waypoints and fell back on their last known headings, some of which, by the geometric accident of orbital mechanics, happened to point more or less toward 7 Theta. It was not a reliable delivery system. It was not a system at all. It was debris, the informational equivalent of wreckage washing ashore after a shipwreck, and the data it carried was incomplete, out of sequence, and sometimes corrupted. But it was enough. Adebio assigned 4 people to the communication building full-time, tasking them with receiving, cataloging, and cross-referencing every fragment that arrived. He did this not because he expected to assemble a complete picture of the crisis from the pieces, though he hoped that might eventually be possible, but because the act of organizing information was itself a form of resistance against the chaos that the silence represented. On 7 Theta, when things broke, you fixed them. When things were unclear, you clarified them. When things were disordered, you ordered them. This was not a philosophy. It was a reflex, a behavioral pattern so deeply ingrained in the community's culture that it functioned like a heartbeat, automatic and unconscious, and absolutely essential to survival. The fragments accumulated. A data cylinder from a drone that had passed within range of a still functional relay near the Turali border contained a partial transcript of a council emergency session. Another drone, arriving 2 days later, carried a compressed file of scientific observations from a Keith Rami research station that had apparently been one of the first to detect the anomaly. A third drone delivered nothing usable, its data cylinder corrupted by subspace interference, but its navigation log provided a valuable piece of indirect evidence. The drone's recorded course showed that it had passed through a region of space where 3 relay stations should have been operational, and its logs indicated that none of them had responded to its automated handshake protocol. Piece by piece, fragment by fragment, like assembling a mosaic from shattered tiles with most of the tiles missing, the picture emerged. What the Council knew, and what they eventually broadcast to every surviving receiver in known space, was this. 63 days prior to the emergency broadcast, a research station orbiting the gas giant Velcora had detected an anomaly in subspace. Not a rupture, not an energy spike, not any of the categories of anomalous event that the research station's automated systems were designed to classify and flag, something subtler, something that did not fit any existing framework. A pattern, a rhythm. Like a heartbeat buried in the fabric of space itself, too faint to be detected by standard instruments at normal ranges, but visible to the Velcora station's sensors, because the station happened to be equipped with a next-generation subspace array that was still in its testing phase, and that was significantly more sensitive than any operational system in the galaxy. The array had been designed by a Keith Rami research team led by a physicist named Athalis, a brilliant, meticulous, deeply serious individual who had devoted the previous 40 years of her life to the study of subspace mechanics, and who was regarded, by those few colleagues capable of maintaining objectivity in the face of her notoriously difficult personality, as the single most knowledgeable living being on the subject. The array was her masterpiece, an instrument so sensitive that it could detect subspace fluctuations at ranges that previous technology could not reach, and it had been installed on the Velcora station specifically because the station's remote location, far from major traffic corridors and their accompanying subspace noise, provided the quiet environment the array needed to function at full capacity. Athalis had not been looking for anomalies. She had been conducting a routine calibration survey, mapping the background subspace topology of the region around Velcora as part of the array's testing protocol. The survey was boring. It was supposed to be boring. The point of the calibration was to establish a baseline, a detailed map of normal conditions against which future observations could be compared. Anomalies were the opposite of what authorities wanted to find during a calibration. They were noise. They were complications. They were problems that would need to be accounted for and corrected before the array could be declared operational. But when the pattern appeared in the data, authorities did not dismiss it as noise. She looked at it. She looked at it for a very long time. She sat in her office on the research station, the gas giant swirling atmosphere filling the viewport behind her with bands of amber and rust. And she stared at the readout on her screen with an expression that her assistant, who had worked with her for 11 years and had learned to read her moods with some accuracy, later described as the face she makes when she is frightened and is too proud to show it. The pattern was regular, not perfectly regular but regular enough to be clearly non-random. It had a frequency of approximately 0.7 Hz in subspace terms, a number that meant nothing in isolation but that authorities recognized, after several hours of cross-referencing, as being in harmonic relationship with the fundamental resonant frequency of the subspace medium itself. This was not supposed to be possible. The fundamental resonant frequency of subspace was a theoretical construct, a mathematical abstraction derived from the equations that described subspace topology. And while those equations predicted that the medium should have a natural frequency, no instrument had ever detected it being expressed as an actual oscillation. It was like discovering that the ocean had a heartbeat. Authali's cataloged the observation with the care and precision that characterized all of her work. She documented the frequency, the amplitude, the spatial distribution, the temporal characteristics. She ran diagnostic checks on the array to rule out instrumental artifacts. She compared the pattern against known sources of subspace interference, of which there were many, and found no match. She consulted with two colleagues on the station, both of whom were initially skeptical and both of whom became less skeptical as they examined the data themselves. After 72 hours of continuous analysis, during which Authali's slept for approximately 4 hours and ate nothing that her assistant did not physically place in front of her, she filed a routine observation report. The report was thorough. It was detailed. It was written in the precise, understated language that Authali's used in all of her professional communications, language that conveyed the full weight of her findings without ever descending into alarm or speculation. She described the pattern, the analytical steps she had taken to verify it, and the preliminary conclusions she had drawn. She noted that the pattern's harmonic relationship to the theoretical subspace resonant frequency was suggestive of a phenomenon worthy of further investigation. She recommended that the array's calibration survey be extended to include a systematic search for similar patterns in adjacent regions of space. She attached the full dataset. She submitted the report through standard channels and returned to her calibration work. Nothing happened for 31 days. Then the pattern changed. Authali's detected the change during a routine monitoring pass, the kind of automatic, repetitive check that she performed at the beginning of each work cycle, the way other people performed morning rituals, without conscious thought but with absolute consistency. The pattern's frequency had increased, not by much, from 0.7 Hz to approximately 0.73 Hz, a change so small that it would have been invisible to any instrument less sensitive than Authali's array. But the array was that sensitive, and Authali's was that meticulous, and she noticed the change the way a master watchmaker notices a deviation of 1 second per week in a mechanism that should be accurate to 1 second per year, with immediate, focused, and entirely rational alarm. She pulled the historical data. She compared the new reading against the previous 31 days of observations. The change was not instantaneous. It had been gradual, a slow, continuous increase that had been occurring since the pattern was first detected, but so slowly that it had fallen below the threshold of the automated alerting systems, which were programmed to flag sudden changes rather than incremental trends. The increase was small in absolute terms but consistent in direction, and when Authali's projected the trend forward using standard extrapolation methods, the projection showed that the frequency would continue to increase, and that the rate of increase itself was increasing, a second derivative effect that meant the change was not linear but accelerating. She filed an updated observation report and, for the first time in her career, flagged it with a priority classification that was one step below emergency. She did this with reluctance because Authali's was not a person who inflated the significance of her findings, and because she knew that applying a priority flag to a subspace observation report would attract attention that she was not certain was warranted, but the acceleration bothered her. It suggested that the phenomenon was not static or stable but dynamic, evolving according to some internal logic that she did not understand, and dynamic phenomena in subspace were, as a general rule, things that warranted attention. The attention came, not immediately, because attention in council space moved through institutional channels at a speed that was determined by factors having more to do with bureaucracy than urgency, but it came. Authali's report was reviewed by a subcommittee of the Keith Rami Academy of Sciences, which requested additional data. She provided it. The subcommittee reviewed the additional data and forwarded it to the Council's Subspace Monitoring Division, which reviewed it and forwarded it to the Council's Office of Scientific Assessment, which reviewed it and forwarded it to the Council's Committee on Emergent Phenomena, which reviewed it and agreed to establish a monitoring task force, a decision that was made 14 days after Authali's priority-flagged report and 22 days after the pattern had begun to accelerate. During those 22 days, the frequency increased from 0.73 Hz to 0.89 Hz. And every subspace relay within 14 light-years went silent. The silence was not destruction. That was the first thing the investigation teams established, and it was perhaps the most unnerving thing about the entire crisis, because destruction was a problem that could be understood and addressed through existing frameworks. Equipment could be replaced, systems could be rebuilt. Destruction, however terrible in its specifics, was a known category of event, a type of failure that the Council's engineering and logistical apparatus was designed to handle. What happened to the relays was not destruction. The relays were still physically intact. Every relay that could be reached by investigation teams, and there were many that could not be reached because the zone of silence was expanding and teams had to race against its advance to reach stations before they were cut off, was in perfect working condition. Power systems were operational, hardware was undamaged, software was functioning normally. The relays had not been attacked, sabotaged, or subjected to any external force that the investigation team's instruments could detect. They were simply not transmitting, not because they had chosen to stop, not because they had been instructed to stop, but because the medium through which they transmitted, the subspace medium that carried FTL signals across interstellar distances, had been altered in their vicinity in a way that made transmission impossible. The investigation teams described the effect in technical language that varied depending on the species and discipline of the team members, but the core description was consistent across all reports. Subspace in the affected region had been smoothed. The term was chosen carefully and with full awareness of its inadequacy. Subspace was not a physical substance that could be smoothed in the literal sense. It was a foundational medium, a substratum of reality that existed beneath normal spacetime and that possessed a topology, a structure of folds and channels and resonant cavities that enabled faster-than-light communication and travel by providing pathways through which signals and vessels could move without being constrained by the speed of light. The topology of subspace was not uniform. It had features, variations in density and curvature that created natural corridors and bottlenecks, and the relay network was designed to exploit these features, placing relay stations at locations where the subspace topology was particularly favorable for signal transmission. In the affected region, those features were gone. The folds had been flattened. The channels had been filled. The resonant cavities had been smoothed into a uniform, featureless plane, like a body of water that had been frozen perfectly smooth, eliminating every ripple and current and eddy that had once given its surface character and function. A ship could still move through the affected region of subspace in the same way that a sled could still be dragged across a frozen lake, but it could not travel faster than light because the pathways that enabled FTL travel no longer existed. A relay could still attempt to transmit in the same way that a person could still attempt to shout into a wall of ice, but the signal would not propagate because the medium's ability to carry it had been removed. The investigation teams could detect the boundary of the affected region with reasonable precision. It was not sharp. It graded from normal subspace to altered subspace over a distance of approximately half a light-year, a transition zone in which the topology became progressively smoother as one moved inward, like the edge of a polishing process that had been applied unevenly. But the boundary could be mapped, and when the teams mapped it, they discovered something that turned the crisis from a localized anomaly into a galactic-scale emergency. The boundary was expanding. Not quickly by the standards of interstellar distances. The initial expansion rate measured over the first week of observation was approximately 0.8 light-years per day, but it was consistent, and more importantly, it was accelerating. The rate of expansion had increased by roughly 12% over the 7-day observation period, following a curve that, when projected forward, suggested that the zone of silence would continue to grow at an increasing rate until something caused it to stop. Nothing in the investigation team's data suggested that anything would cause it to stop. Within a week of the relays going silent, the zone of silence had expanded to encompass 40 light-years. Within 2 weeks, over 100. The numbers were difficult to comprehend, even for species that had been navigating interstellar distances for millennia. 100 light-years was not a large distance in the context of the galaxy as a whole. The galaxy was 100,000 light-years across, and the Council's jurisdiction, though it did not extend to the entirety of the galaxy, encompassed tens of thousands of light-years in every direction from the core worlds. 100 light-years was a fraction of a percent of that total. But 100 light-years was enormous in the context of what lived within it. Within the first 100 light-years of the zone's expansion, there were 47 relay stations, 12 inhabited star systems with a combined population of approximately 2 billion beings, 6 major trade routes, 3 military installations, 2 research stations, and 1 automated fuel depot that supplied vessels traveling along the northern arc of the broadened trade corridor. All of these things were now inside the zone of silence. All of them were cut off from the relay network. None of them could communicate with the outside world by any means faster than a conventional light-speed signal, which meant that a message sent from the nearest affected system to the nearest unaffected system would take years to arrive. The ships that had been inside the zone when the boundary reached them were in a particularly precarious position. Their FTL drives were inoperative. They could still travel through normal space, but normal space travel between star systems took years or decades, and the ships were not designed for it. They carried supplies intended for journeys of days or weeks, not years. Their life support systems could be sustained, but only if they could find a place to resupply, and the places they could reach were themselves cut off from the supply chains that kept them stocked. The Council convened an emergency session, not the committee-level discussions that had characterized the initial response to Othali's reports, but a full session of the Council itself, the governing body that represented the major species of known space and that possessed the authority to allocate resources, direct military forces, and make binding decisions that affected every being under its jurisdiction. Full sessions were rare. They were convened only in circumstances of extreme urgency, and the last time one had been called was during the Fracture Wars, 40 years after the wars had ended, to ratify the peace settlement. The session was held in the Council chamber on the Turelli homeworld, a vast circular space designed to accommodate representatives of every species that held Council membership, with seating arrangements that had been optimized over centuries to minimize the visual and acoustic conflicts that arose when beings with radically different sensory systems and physical dimensions were required to share a room. The chamber was full. Every delegation was present. Every delegation was frightened. The Turelli spoke first. As the host species and the most technologically advanced of the Council members, the Turelli delegation traditionally opened emergency sessions with an assessment of the situation and a proposed framework for response. The delegate, an elderly statesman named Torvesen who had served on the Council for over 60 years and who was widely regarded as one of the most skilled diplomats in known space, spoke with the calm, measured authority that his position demanded. But those who knew him well, and there were many in the chamber who did, could see the tension in the set of his shoulders and the slight tremor in his hands that he kept hidden beneath the edge of the speaking podium. The Turelli assessment was bleak. They had the most advanced understanding of subspace mechanics of any species in the Council, and that understanding, extensive as it was, did not encompass the phenomenon they were observing. The smoothing of subspace topology was not a process that existed in any Turelli theoretical framework. There were models that described subspace distortion, subspace disruption, subspace collapse, and subspace resonance, but none of them described a process that selectively removed topological features from the medium while leaving the underlying substrate intact. It was, Torvesen said, choosing his words with the precision of a man walking through a minefield, an unprecedented phenomenon that challenges our fundamental understanding of the medium upon which interstellar civilization depends. He did not say that the Turelli did not know what was happening. He did not need to. Everyone in the chamber understood that unprecedented in the mouth of a Turelli scientist was the most alarming word in any language. The Keithrami delegation spoke next. Othali's was present, having been transported from the Velcora station by a military courier that had been dispatched to retrieve her before the zone of silence reached the station's location. She had spent the journey reviewing data and refining her analysis, and she presented her findings to the Council with the same meticulous precision she brought to all of her work. But there was an edge to her presentation that her colleagues had never heard before, a sharpness that came from the knowledge that she had been the first to see this coming and had not been able to make anyone listen fast enough. She described the pattern she had detected, its harmonic relationship to the theoretical subspace resonant frequency, and its acceleration. She presented a model, preliminary and admittedly speculative, that suggested the smoothing effect was a direct consequence of the pattern's activity, that the oscillation she had detected was somehow interacting with the subspace medium in a way that progressively erased its topological features. She was careful to note the gaps in her understanding. She did not know the mechanism. She did not know the source. She did not know whether the pattern was natural or artificial, though she noted that the precision of its harmonic relationship to the subspace resonant frequency was suggestive of intentionality. A phrase that landed in the chamber like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of alarmed murmuring through the delegations. The Broaden delegation spoke last, and their contribution was the most visceral. The Broaden were a warrior species, not by cultural preference but by biological necessity, possessing a physiology that produced aggressive behavioral responses to perceived threats and that had, over their evolutionary history, made them both formidable in combat and difficult in diplomacy. They had, with considerable effort over many centuries, learned to moderate their responses in the council chamber. But the effort was visible, a constant tension in their large, muscled frames that other species had learned to read as a measure of how strongly the Broaden felt about a given topic. The Broaden delegate, a massive individual named Greveth who wore the scars of 17 combat engagements on his hide like medals, did not speak about subspace mechanics or theoretical models. He spoke about logistics. The Broaden military infrastructure depended entirely on FTL coordination. Their supply chains, their communication networks, their troop deployment capabilities, all of it was built on the assumption that subspace travel and communication would be available at all times and in all places. If the zone of silence continued to expand, and if no countermeasure was developed, the Broaden military would become functionally blind and paralyzed, unable to project force, unable to support allied forces, unable to defend their own territory. Greveth did not use the word paralyzed. He used the word finished, and he said it in the flat, declarative tone that Broaden used to describe facts that were too obvious to require emphasis, a tone that somehow made the word more alarming than any amount of rhetorical flourish could have achieved. "We are not a species that depends on subtlety," Greveth said. "We depend on speed and coordination. Remove those and we are nothing. And what removes them is not something we can fight. You cannot shoot a phenomenon. You cannot punch a frequency. We are being dismantled not by an enemy we can see and kill, but by a process we do not understand, and I need someone in this chamber to tell me how to stop it, or I need someone to tell me what we do when it cannot be stopped." Nobody told him. The council's best scientific minds were assembled. The greatest physicists, engineers, and subspace theorists of 7 species were brought together in a research facility on the Turelli homeworld, given unlimited access to computational resources and data from every instrument that could still reach them, and told to solve the problem. They worked in shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Teams of researchers rotated through the facility in overlapping schedules that ensured continuous progress, or at least continuous effort, because progress itself was elusive to the point of invisibility. They ran simulations, they built models, they tested hypotheses, they argued. They argued with a ferocity that would have been alarming in any other context. But that was, in this context, simply the sound of intelligent beings struggling with a problem that exceeded their collective capacity. The intellectual equivalent of the sounds made by people trying to move a boulder that is too heavy for any of them to shift alone, each person pushing in a slightly different direction based on their own understanding of the boulder's shape and weight. None of them wrong, but none of them sufficient. The effort coordinated but not unified, productive but not conclusive. The Turelli team, led by a subspace theorist named Kales who was widely considered the second most knowledgeable living being on the subject after Othales, focused on the mechanism of the smoothing effect. How was it happening? What physical process could account for the selective removal of topological features from subspace while leaving the underlying substrate intact? They explored dozens of theoretical models, each more exotic than the last, and found that none of them could reproduce the observed effects with sufficient fidelity to be considered viable. The problem was not that the models were wrong in detail. The problem was that the models were wrong in kind. They were trying to explain the smoothing effect using frameworks that assumed subspace was a passive medium, a stage upon which physical processes played out, and the evidence increasingly suggested that subspace was not passive at all, that the smoothing was not something being done to subspace by an external force, but something that subspace itself was doing or being caused to do from within. The Keithrami team, working closely with Othales, focused on the pattern. What was generating it? Where did it originate? Could its source be located and potentially interrupted? They traced the pattern back through the accumulated data from the Velcora array and from every other instrument that had detected it, trying to establish a point of origin, a location in space from which the oscillation was emanating. This proved extraordinarily difficult because the pattern was not a signal in the conventional sense. It was not traveling through subspace from a source to a receiver. It was a property of subspace itself in the affected region, a resonance that existed simultaneously throughout the zone, like the vibration of a drumhead that is struck at one point but vibrates everywhere. There was no source to locate because the pattern had no source, or rather it had a source, but the source was not a point in space. It was something else, something that the Keith Rami team's instruments and theories could not identify, a something that existed in a category that did not yet have a name. The Broaden team, true to their species' character, focused on countermeasures. If they could not understand the phenomenon, could they disrupt it? They proposed, and in some cases tested, a series of increasingly desperate interventions, including the detonation of high-yield subspace warheads at the boundary of the affected region, the injection of massive energy pulses into the subspace medium in an attempt to re-establish topological features by force, and the deployment of gravitational field generators designed to create artificial subspace distortions that might theoretically counteract the smoothing effect. None of them worked. The warheads detonated and produced spectacular releases of energy that were absorbed by the subspace medium without producing any measurable effect on the smoothing. The energy pulses propagated outward and dissipated. The gravitational field generators created local distortions that lasted for fractions of a second before being erased, as if the smoothing process were casually brushing aside the interference like a person brushing away a fly. Other teams investigated related questions. Could the rate of expansion be predicted with greater precision? Could the boundary's shape be mapped in enough detail to identify patterns that might suggest underlying structure? Were there any species in Council history, including extinct or precouncil species, that had encountered similar phenomena? The answers were somewhat, partially, and no. The expansion rate followed the accelerating curve that Thales had identified, with a confidence interval that narrowed as more data accumulated, but that still left significant uncertainty about the long-term trajectory. The boundary shape was irregular, almost organic in its contours, bulging in some directions and thin in others, as if something were moving through subspace with intention, smoothing the medium as it went, erasing the pathways that connected star systems like someone erasing lines on a map. But the pattern of the bulges and thin spots did not correspond to any known feature of subspace topology or stellar geography, which meant either that the process was influenced by factors the teams could not identify or that it was genuinely random, both of which were equally unhelpful conclusions. And no species in the available historical record, which extended back over 20,000 years for the oldest council members, had ever documented anything resembling the current phenomenon. The researchers were not stupid, they were not incompetent, they were not lacking in resources or motivation or creativity. They were by any reasonable measure the most capable collection of scientific minds that the galaxy could assemble, drawn from the most advanced civilizations in known space, working with the best available data and the most powerful computational tools ever created. And they could not solve the problem. Not because they were failing individually, but because the problem existed at a scale and in a domain that their collective knowledge simply did not cover. They were like a group of master carpenters confronted with a broken engine. Their skills were real and formidable, but they were the wrong skills for the task, and no amount of skill in carpentry could repair a machine that operated on principles outside the carpenter's understanding. The Council's best hypothesis, and it was a desperate one, was that they were witnessing a natural subspace collapse. Not a localized event, but a systemic one. A resetting of the fundamental medium that enabled interstellar travel and communication, a process analogous to the geological processes that reshaped planetary surfaces over eons, except that it was happening in subspace and on a timescale of months rather than millennia. The hypothesis was based on the absence of any evidence for artificial causation, the apparent organic quality of the boundary's shape, and the fact that no known technology, not even the most advanced, could produce effects of this scale and nature. If that hypothesis was correct, and if the collapse continued at its current rate, then within approximately 18 months, no ship in the galaxy would be able to travel faster than light. No relay would function, every star system would be isolated, every connection between every world would be severed. The civilization that the Council governed, a civilization that had been built on the assumption that distance was negotiable, and that any 2 points in known space could be connected by a relay signal or an FTL vessel, would cease to exist as an interstellar entity. It would become a collection of isolated islands, each trapped in its own bubble of normal space, unable to communicate or interact with any other island, reduced to whatever resources and capabilities it possessed locally. For most worlds, this would be survivable. Unpleasant, disruptive, traumatic in ways that were difficult to fully anticipate but survivable. Most Council worlds were self-sufficient in basic necessities. They could feed their populations, generate their own power, maintain their own infrastructure. They would lose access to imported goods, specialized technologies, and the cultural and intellectual exchange that interstellar connectivity provided, but they would not die. For some worlds, it would not be survivable. Worlds that depended on imported food, or imported water, or imported medical supplies. Worlds with populations too large to be sustained by local resources. Worlds whose environments were artificially maintained by technologies that required components manufactured elsewhere. These worlds would face catastrophe within months of isolation. Catastrophe on a scale that the Council's emergency response capabilities, which themselves depended on FTL travel and communication, would be unable to address. The Council debated the hypothesis. They debated the projections. They debated the proposed responses, which range from the construction of massive shelter infrastructure on vulnerable worlds to the evacuation of at-risk populations to self-sufficient worlds, a logistical undertaking of staggering scale that would require every available FTL vessel and would itself be undermined by the expanding zone of silence. They debated whether to inform the public or to suppress the information to prevent panic, a debate that was rendered moot when the information leaked, as information always does, through channels that no security protocol can fully seal. They debated for days. While they debated, the zone grew. While they debated, relay stations went dark. While they debated, ships that had entered the affected region found themselves unable to leave, their FTL drives inert, their crews facing the prospect of years-long journeys through normal space to reach systems that might themselves be dark by the time they arrived. And then, on the 14th day of the emergency session, a member of the Keith Rami delegation raised a point that had not yet been discussed. "We are making assumptions," said the delegate, a younger Keith Rami than Othales, a theoretician named Ithessa who had been quiet through most of the proceedings but who spoke now with a clarity that cut through the exhausted, frayed atmosphere of the chamber like a blade through cloth. "We are assuming that this phenomenon is unprecedented because our instruments have not detected it before, but our instruments have not been everywhere. They have not been monitoring every region of space continuously for extended periods. They have been focused on active regions, traffic corridors, strategic locations. We have been looking where the light is, not where the dark is, and we are concluding that nothing exists in the dark because we cannot see it." She paused, letting the silence work. The Velcora array detected this phenomenon because it was sensitive enough to detect it, and because it happened to be located where the phenomenon was occurring. But the phenomenon may have been occurring elsewhere, at lower intensities, for much longer than 63 days. We would not know. We have no data from elsewhere that is comparable in sensitivity or duration to the Velcora data. We are making conclusions based on a single data point, and a single data point, no matter how precise, cannot establish a trend. Torvesen the Turelli statesman looked at her with tired eyes. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting," Ithessa said, "that we ask, not our instruments, not our experts, everyone, every settled world, every research station, every outpost, no matter how small or remote, no matter how primitive their equipment or how marginal their status. We ask them all for subspace data, gravitational resonance data, any measurement of any phenomenon that might be related to what we are observing. Because somewhere, possibly somewhere we have never thought to look, someone may have been watching the sky for longer than we have, and they may have seen something that we missed." The suggestion was practical. It was obvious in retrospect, the kind of thing that should have been proposed on the first day of the crisis rather than the 14th. But it had not been proposed because the Council's instinct in a crisis was to look inward, to consult its own experts, its own instruments, its own databases, and to treat external sources of information as supplementary rather than essential. The Council represented the most advanced civilizations in known space. Asking marginal outposts for data felt, to many in the chamber, like asking children for medical advice. But they were desperate, and desperate people do things that proud people do not. The Council approved Ithessa's proposal and drafted a broadcast message to be transmitted to every surviving receiver in known space. The message was shorter than the original emergency broadcast, more specific in its request, and carefully worded to convey both the severity of the crisis and the genuine openness of the Council to any contribution, regardless of its source. It asked every settled world, every research station, every outpost, no matter how small or remote, to submit any data that might be relevant: subspace readings, gravitational anomalies, unusual sensor logs, background measurements, anything. The message emphasized that no submission would be considered too marginal, too primitive, or too incomplete to be valuable. A statement that would have been considered extraordinary in any other context, but that in this context was simply an acknowledgement that the Council's own extraordinary resources had proven insufficient. The message was transmitted on every frequency that the remaining relay network could support. It reached hundreds of worlds and stations and outposts across known space. Most of the recipients had no data to submit. They had standard-issue sensor packages designed for navigation and weather monitoring, instruments that could not detect subspace phenomena at any meaningful resolution. Some recipients had better equipment but had not been monitoring continuously. and THEIR Chinese letter D a T, O was no more useful than the Council's own. A few recipients submitted data that was promising on initial review, but that upon analysis proved to be unrelated to the phenomenon. And one recipient, a forgotten human outpost on a world with no name, submitted 300 years of continuous gravitational resonance data that would, within weeks, overturn everything the Council thought it knew about the crisis. Adebio read the Council's second broadcast on the 8th day after the first. It arrived via a relay drone that had somehow made it through the degrading network, its data cylinder containing not only the broadcast itself, but also a compressed file of technical specifications that described, in detail, the kinds of data the Council was requesting. He read the specifications carefully, sitting at his desk in the town hall with a cup of tea that had gone cold beside him. And as he read, a thought formed in his mind that was not quite an idea and not quite a memory, but something in between. A sense of connection between what the Council was asking for and something that existed on this plateau. Something that had always existed. Something so familiar and so ubiquitous that it had become invisible through sheer proximity. He went to find Drasa. Drasa Okonkwo was 78 years old and had been the Outpost's monitor chief for 63 of those years, having assumed the role at the age of 15 when her predecessor, a man named Cole who had trained her since she was 9, had suffered a stroke that left him unable to perform the precise calibration work that the monitors required. She had taken over the duties without ceremony or hesitation, not because she was ambitious or eager for responsibility, but because the work needed to be done and she was the one who knew how to do it. A calculus that had governed every major decision in her life, and that she applied with the same unthinking consistency that other people applied to breathing. She was small, thin, and weathered, with skin the color of dark honey that had been lined and textured by decades of outdoor work and plateau wind into a topography that mapped her history more accurately than any written record. Her hair was pure white, cut short in the practical style favored by most of the outpost's older residents, and her eyes, dark brown and slightly magnified by the reading glasses she had worn since her 50th year, were sharp and alert in a way that contradicted the frailty of her frame. She moved slowly, not because she was infirm, but because she had learned, over decades of working with delicate instruments, that speed was the enemy of precision, and that it was always better to do something slowly and correctly than quickly and wrong. She lived alone in a small stone house near the first monitor station, a squat building on the eastern edge of the plateau that she had occupied for 50 years and that was filled, floor to ceiling, with calibration tools, data records, spare components, and the accumulated physical debris of a lifetime spent maintaining a technical system that no one outside the outpost had ever asked about. The interior smelled of metal and paper, and the faintly herbal scent of the tea she drank constantly, a local blend that she brewed strong and slightly bitter, and that she consumed at a rate that would have concerned a physician had the outpost's medical staff not long ago concluded that Drasa's body had simply adapted to caffeine at a level that would be toxic to most people. Adebio found her in the monitor station, as he had expected to. She was sitting at the primary readout console, a device that occupied an entire wall of the station's single room and that consisted of a series of analog displays, digital readouts, and hand-built interface panels that had been modified and upgraded so many times over the centuries that the original components were outnumbered by replacement parts by a ratio of roughly 10 to 1. She was performing a routine calibration check on the northern sensor cluster, her fingers moving across the controls with a precision that was almost musical in its rhythm, each adjustment made with the confidence of someone who had performed this sequence thousands of times, and who understood, at a level deeper than conscious thought, what each adjustment was supposed to achieve and how to recognize when it had been achieved correctly. She did not look up when Adebio entered. She knew his footsteps. "You've read the broadcast," she said. It was not a question. "I've read it. And you're here because of the monitors." Adebio pulled a chair from the corner of the room and sat down beside her. The chair scraped against the stone floor with a sound that was absorbed by the cluttered interior, lost among the shelves of records and the banks of instruments and the general atmosphere of purposeful density that characterized every workspace on the outpost. He looked at the readout displays, the familiar patterns of numbers and waveforms that he had seen 1,000 times, but that he had never looked at with the particular kind of attention that the Council's broadcast had suddenly made relevant. "The Council is asking for gravitational resonance data," he said. "Continuous readings. Long-term, they want to compare what's happening now with what was happening before to see if there's a pattern they missed." Drasa made a small sound that might have been a hum of acknowledgement, or might have been the beginning of a thought that she had not yet decided to express. She completed the calibration adjustment she was working on, checked the result against the expected values, nodded to herself in the way she always did when a calibration met her standards, and then turned to look at Adebio with an expression that was not surprise and not excitement but something more contained. Something that belonged to a woman who had spent 63 years watching the same instruments and who understood, in ways that went beyond rational analysis, that the thing she had been watching might have been more important than anyone had ever realized. Our monitors aren't subspace sensors, she said. I know. They measure gravitational effects. Local, crustal, they were built to predict mineral storms, that's all they were built for. I know. She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes, behind the magnification of her glasses, were unreadable. But subspace has gravitational effects, she said slowly, feeling her way through the statement as if it were a path she had never walked before but that her feet somehow recognized. That's how it works. Subspace topology is determined by gravitational fields. The folds and channels, the features that the Council's relays use, they're shaped by gravity. So if something is changing in subspace, if those features are being smoothed away, that change would produce gravitational effects. Effects that our monitors might have been detecting, not as subspace data but as gravitational data, because that's what they're designed to measure. Adebio nodded. He had followed the same chain of reasoning to reach the same conclusion, but hearing it spoken aloud by Drassa in her slow, careful, precise way gave it a weight and a reality that his private thoughts had not possessed. This was how it worked on 7 Theta. Ideas did not become real until they were spoken, until they were shared, until they existed in the space between people rather than only in the space inside a single mind. The Council said they want continuous data, Adebio said. Long-term, how long have our monitors been recording? Drassa turned back to the console. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached for a binder, a thick, heavy volume bound in local leather that was sitting on a shelf beside the console, and opened it to a page near the beginning. The binder contained maintenance logs, handwritten entries in a script that had changed slightly over the centuries, but that was still legible to anyone who had been trained to read it. Each entry recording a calibration check, a component replacement, or an observation about the monitor network's performance. The first entry was dated 302 years ago. It was written in a hand that was neat and careful and slightly uncertain. The hand of someone who was not entirely confident that what they were recording would ever be read by anyone but themselves. Continuously, Drassa said, with gaps for equipment failures and power outages, but those gaps are documented and they account for less than 2% of the total record. 300 years, Adebio. 300 years of continuous gravitational resonance readings from the same location, using instruments that have been maintained and calibrated in an unbroken chain from the first day to this one. She closed the binder and set it on the console with a deliberateness that was almost ceremonial. We don't have subspace sensors, she said. We never have. But we have been measuring the gravitational shadow of subspace for 3 centuries, and we have been writing it down, every reading, every shift, every day, because that is what we do. We watch, we record, we maintain, and the data is here, all of it. Adebio felt something move in his chest, a physical sensation that was not quite a heartbeat and not quite a breath but something that occupied the space between the two. A feeling that he would later recognize, in the quiet of his own home with Essa beside him, as the moment when the weight of 300 years shifted from being a burden to being a gift. But that recognition came later. In the monitor station, with Drassa beside him and the analog displays humming their quiet, continuous song of numbers and waveforms, he asked the question that would change everything. Has that background hum ever changed? The background hum was a term of art among the Outpost's monitor technicians. It referred to a signal that appeared in every reading from every monitor in the network, a faint, constant resonance at a frequency that was distinct from the storm signatures and geological features that the monitors were designed to track. It was present in every dataset, every calibration check, every maintenance log. It had always been there for as long as anyone could remember, for as long as the records went back, and it had always been treated as what it appeared to be, a baseline. A natural feature of the planet's gravitational environment, a hum generated by the interaction of the planet's internal structure with the gravitational fields of the twin suns and the surrounding stellar neighborhood. It was the acoustic equivalent of the color of the walls in a room you spend your entire life in. So constant, so pervasive, that your brain stopped registering it as a distinct phenomenon and simply incorporated it into the background texture of reality. Every technician who had ever worked with the monitors had been trained to account for the hum when analyzing data. You measured the hum, you subtracted it from your readings, and you worked with the residual signal which contained the information you actually cared about, the gravitational shifts that preceded mineral storms, the crustal movements that indicated geological instability, the subtle variations that correlated with seasonal changes in the planet's orbit. The hum was not interesting. The hum was not useful. The hum was just there, like the wind, like the grass, like the twin suns, a permanent feature of the environment that you acknowledged and moved past. Drasa had never questioned the hum, not once in 63 years. She had calibrated around it, compensated for it, and ignored it with the same unconscious efficiency that she brought to every other aspect of her work. It was part of the furniture of her professional life, as familiar and as unremarkable as the console she sat at or the chair she sat on. If anyone had asked her about it before this moment, and no one ever had, she would have described it in the same flat, factual terms she used to describe every other aspect of the monitor network: frequency, amplitude, consistency, origin. She would not have said it was interesting. She would not have said it was mysterious. She would have said it was the hum, and she would have moved on. But Adebio had asked if it had ever changed, and the question, simple and direct as it was, landed in Drossa's mind like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples through layers of assumption and habit and unconscious certainty that had been undisturbed for 6 decades. Had it changed? She did not know. She knew it was constant. She knew it was always there. She knew its parameters by heart because she had measured them thousands of times. But the question was not whether it was constant from one reading to the next. The question was whether it was constant from one decade to the next, from one generation to the next, across the entire span of the record. And that was a different question entirely, because answering it required comparing readings that had been taken with different instruments, different calibration standards, and different measurement protocols over a period of 300 years. And the act of making those comparisons required accounting for changes in the instruments themselves that were at least as large as any change in the signal they were measuring. It was, in other words, a problem of exactly the kind that Drossa was uniquely qualified to solve. Not because she was a genius. She would have rejected that label with the same matter-of-fact dismissal she applied to all forms of unnecessary praise. But because she knew the monitor network better than any living person, because she had maintained its instruments and studied its records for longer than anyone else, and because she possessed the particular kind of meticulous, patient, detail-obsessed mind that could hold 300 years of data in its grasp and see patterns that span generations. "I'll check," she said. It took her 36 hours. She began by pulling the archived data. The Outpost records were stored in multiple formats, a consequence of 300 years of changing technology and persistent resource constraints. The oldest records, dating back to the first decades of the settlement, were handwritten in the maintenance binders, individual numerical entries recorded by technicians who had worked with the original instruments, and who had documented their readings with a care and precision that was, under the circumstances, extraordinary. These early records were sparse by modern standards, a single reading per hour rather than the continuous streams that the modern instruments produced, but they were consistent and they were complete, and they represented a baseline against which all subsequent data could be compared. The middle records, covering roughly the 2nd century of the Outpost's existence, had been transcribed from handwritten logs to a primitive digital format using equipment that had been built locally for the purpose, a slow and laborious process that had taken the better part of a decade to complete, and that had introduced its own set of transcription errors, most of which had been caught and corrected by the technicians who performed the work, but some of which had survived undetected in the dataset. Drossa knew about these errors because she had found and corrected several of them herself during her decades of working with the records, and she knew where to look for others that might still be lurking in the data. The modern records, covering the most recent century, were stored in a digital archive maintained by the Outpost communication equipment, a system that was primitive by council standards, but that was functional, and that could produce data in formats that could be analyzed using mathematical tools that Drossa had either developed herself or inherited from her predecessors. The challenge was not accessing the data. The challenge was making it comparable. A gravitational resonance reading taken by the original instruments 300 years ago was not directly comparable to a reading taken by the current instruments today. Because the instruments were different, their sensitivity was different, their calibration standards were different, and the mathematical frameworks used to process their outputs were different. To compare them, Drossa had to account for every difference, every change in instrumentation and methodology that had occurred over 300 years, creating a unified dataset in which every reading was expressed in terms that were consistent across the entire time span. This was the kind of work that, in a council research facility, would have been assigned to a team of data scientists working with specialized software and powerful computers. Drossa did it alone, with pencil and paper and a hand-calculated conversion framework that she developed as she went, working through the night and through the following day, fueled by tea and by the particular quality of concentration that comes from knowing that you are looking for something that may not be there, but that you will not be able to forgive yourself for missing if it is. She cross-referenced the baseline hum against every variable she could think of. Storm events, seasonal shifts, equipment calibrations, component replacements, power fluctuations, temperature changes in the monitor stations, seismic activity, solar activity from the twin suns. Every factor that could conceivably influence a gravitational resonance reading, she checked and accounted for, subtracting its effects from the data to isolate the hum itself, the pure signal stripped of every confounding variable, the thing that remained when everything else was explained away. When she finished, she sat in Adebio's office with a cup of tea that had gone cold for the second time in 2 days, and she told him something that made his hands go cold. The hum had changed. Not recently, not suddenly. It had been changing for 300 years, slowly, steadily. The frequency was shifting, increasing at a rate so gradual that no single technician in any single generation had ever noticed it, because the change from one decade to the next was smaller than the margin of calibration error that any reasonable person would attribute to instrumental drift. But across 3 centuries of continuous data, with the instrumental drift accounted for and subtracted, the trend was unmistakable. The frequency was rising, and the amplitude was growing, and the rate of change when plotted over the full 300-year span was not linear, it was accelerating. The acceleration was the key. A linear change could be explained by natural processes, planetary evolution, slow shifts in the gravitational environment caused by the movement of celestial bodies over geological timescales. But an accelerating change was different. An accelerating change implied a driving force that was itself intensifying, a process that was not passive but active, not static but dynamic. And an accelerating change in a gravitational resonance signal that was, by its very nature, a measurement of the gravitational shadow of subspace, implied a process that was occurring in subspace itself. Drassa laid her analysis out on Adebio's desk. Sheets of hand-calculated figures, conversion tables, cross-reference matrices, and a single hand-drawn graph that plotted the hum's frequency over 300 years, the line rising slowly at first and then more steeply, like the curve of a hill that starts gently and then steepens as you approach the summit, except that this curve had no summit, no plateau, no indication that it would ever stop rising. Adebio looked at the graph for a long time. He was not a scientist. He was a water systems coordinator who had become a mayor, a practical man who dealt in pipes and pumps and people, not in frequencies and amplitudes and acceleration curves. But he could read a graph, he could see what the line was doing, and he could understand with the intuitive certainty that came from a lifetime of working with systems that changed over time what that line meant. "It matches," he said. Drassa nodded. She had already made the comparison. The frequency of the background hum when extrapolated forward from the 300-year trend matched the frequency of the anomaly that the Velcora station had detected, not approximately, not roughly, precisely, the same frequency, the same acceleration curve. The same pattern that had been invisible to the most advanced instruments in the galaxy when viewed over 63 days was clearly, undeniably visible in the data from a network of hand-built gravitational monitors on a forgotten outpost when viewed over 300 years. "We've been recording this since the beginning," Drassa said. Her voice was quiet, but there was a quality in it that Adebio had never heard before, a tremor that was not weakness but the sound of someone encountering something that was larger than the framework they had built their life around, something that forced a reevaluation not just of a specific fact but of the entire context in which that fact existed. Since the first year, the first instruments detected it. They didn't know what it was. They called it a baseline. Every generation after them called it a baseline. And all the while it was changing right under our hands. Every time we calibrated, every time we measured, every time we wrote down a number, we were recording something that was alive, something that was moving, something that was heading toward whatever it is that's happening now. She took a sip of her cold tea and did not taste it. "We weren't watching for it," she said. "We didn't know to watch for it, but we were watching anyway, 300 years of watching, because that's what we do." Adebio looked at the graph again. The line rose. The years stretched across the bottom of the page, each one representing a generation of people who had lived and worked and died on this plateau, each one contributing their small portion of the data, their individual readings added to the collective record like stones in a wall. None of them knowing what the wall would eventually reveal, but all of them building it anyway, because the work was there and they were the ones to do it. He thought about Valsier, the Turelli inspector who had visited 212 years ago and had spent 4 hours on the surface, and had written 11 paragraphs describing a colony that poses no concern and requires no attention. He thought about the petition that had been answered with a form letter. He thought about the 300 years of silence from the council, the unreturned messages, the unfulfilled requests, the slow, grinding indifference of an institution that had decided long ago that this place and these people were not worth its time. And he thought about Drassa and Cole before her, and the chain of technicians stretching back 3 centuries to the people who had built the first monitors from salvaged transport vessel parts. And he felt something that was not anger and not vindication and not grief, but a complex, layered emotion that contained elements of all three, and that was directed not at the council, but at the people of this outpost, including himself, who had done the work without being asked, without being recognized, without being supported, and who had done it anyway, because the work mattered and they were there to do it. "We need to send this to them," he said. Drassa nodded. "I'll prepare the data package." She stood, and her knees creaked, and she placed her cold teacup on Adebio's desk with the careful precision that characterized every physical action she performed. And she walked out of the office to begin the work of compiling 300 years of observations into a format that the galaxy's greatest minds could understand. It took her 3 days. Adebio called a town gathering on the evening of the day he received Drassa's analysis. Not because the decision to submit the data required community approval. It did not legally or practically. As mayor, Adebio had the authority to communicate with external bodies on behalf of the outpost, and the council's broadcast had explicitly requested data submissions from all recipients. But Adebio did not lead by authority, he led by consensus. The data belonged to the community. It had been produced by the community's labor, maintained by the community's effort, and preserved by the community's dedication across 3 centuries. Sending it to the council was not a decision that one person should make, even a person who happened to hold the title of mayor. 47,000 people did not fit in the town hall. The town hall was the largest building in the settlement, a stone structure that had been expanded 4 times over the centuries to accommodate a growing population, but it could hold perhaps 1,000 people at most, standing shoulder to shoulder. So the gathering was held in the open square, the central space where the main paths converged, the flat area of packed earth that served as the outpost's unofficial public forum. The people came, all of them, not because they were commanded to and not because they were afraid, but because the emergency broadcast had changed something in the atmosphere of the settlement, a subtle shift in the quality of daily life that everyone had felt but no one had articulated. The broadcast had broken the silence. For 300 years, the silence of being ignored had been a constant, as much a part of the outpost's environment as the wind or the grass. You did not notice it, but you lived inside it, and it shaped everything the way living inside a sound shapes the way you speak. The broadcast had pierced that silence with a voice from the outside world, a voice that said, in effect, "We need you." And the piercing had produced a wound that was not painful but was disorienting, like suddenly hearing a sound in a room you had believed to be empty. They gathered in the square as the twin suns set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and copper that deepened to violet as the light faded. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, their faces turned toward the wooden platform that had been erected at one end of the square for public addresses. A platform that was used perhaps a dozen times a year, and that was, like everything else on the outpost, functional rather than decorative. Old people stood in the back, leaning on canes or on each other, their faces weathered and calm. Expressions of people who had seen enough to know that panic was a luxury and that the appropriate response to uncertainty was patience. Young people stood closer to the front, their faces alert and tense. Expressions of people who had not yet seen enough to know these things and who were experiencing the particular anxiety of the young when the world suddenly reveals itself to be larger and more dangerous than they had been led to believe. The wind moved through the crowd, carrying the amber scent of the grasslands and the cooler air from the mountains. Someone had lit lanterns along the edges of the square, their soft light casting warm, flickering shadows across the gathered faces, giving the scene a quality that was not quite solemn and not quite festive but something in between. Something that belonged to a community that had learned over 3 centuries to treat all significant moments with the same measured seriousness, neither exaggerating their importance nor diminishing it. Adebio stood on the platform and looked out at the faces. He knew many of them, not all, not 47,000, but enough to feel the weight of their attention as a physical thing, a pressure on his chest that was not unpleasant but that was substantial, the accumulated presence of people who trusted him to tell them the truth and who would know immediately if he did not. He spoke in plain language, not the formal council standard of the broadcast, but the version of common speech that had evolved on 7 Theta over 3 centuries, a dialect that was simpler in grammar and richer in practical vocabulary than the standard form, a language that had been shaped by the need to communicate clearly about concrete things in an environment where misunderstanding could mean failed crops or broken equipment, or in the early years, death. He explained the broadcast. He explained the crisis as the fragments had described it. Something was happening to subspace, the medium that connected star systems, and it was spreading. He explained that the council was asking for data, any data that might help them understand what was happening. He did not embellish. He did not speculate about causes or outcomes. He told them what was known and acknowledged what was not known. drawing a line between fact and uncertainty with the same precision he applied to calibrating a water pump. Then he told them about the monitors, about Drossa's discovery, about the hum that had been changing for 300 years, invisible to each generation but undeniable across all generations. About the graph that showed the acceleration, the curve that matched the anomaly the Council's scientists had detected 63 days ago, but that the Outpost had been recording since before the Council's emergency protocols existed. He held up a copy of the graph. The lantern light caught the pencil lines, the hand-drawn axis labels, the small, precise notations that Drossa had added in her cramped, meticulous handwriting. It looked in that light like what it was, a piece of paper with marks on it, produced by a 78-year-old woman using pencil and paper and 300 years of handwritten records in a stone building on the edge of a windy plateau. It did not look like something that could save a galaxy. But Adebio held it up and the people in the square looked at it and they understood. Not the science, not all of them understood the science. Many of them would not have been able to explain what a gravitational resonance signal was or why its frequency mattered or how it related to subspace topology. But they understood the shape of the story. They understood it because it was their story. A thing built by hand, maintained by hand, improved by hand, generation after generation, not for glory or recognition or reward, but because it was there and it needed doing and they were the ones to do it. And now, after 300 years of being invisible, the thing they had built was the thing the galaxy needed. A woman near the front raised her hand. She was a farmer, middle-aged, with soil stains on her hands and a practical directness in her voice that was characteristic of the Outpost's agricultural workers. "We don't have subspace sensors," she said. "We never have. They're asking for subspace data. Can our gravitational data actually help them?" Adebio looked at her. "Drossa says yes. The hum we've been recording, the background signal, it's the gravitational shadow of whatever is happening in subspace. We can't see subspace directly, but we can see its footprint, and we've been tracking that footprint for 300 years. Another voice from further back in the crowd, a young man, one of the power system technicians. "Why didn't we notice this before? If the hum has been changing for 3 centuries, why are we only seeing it now?" Adebio did not look at Drossa, who was standing at the edge of the platform with her hands folded and her face expressionless, but he answered the question in a way that gave her full credit without nomming her. "'Cause the change is too small to see in a single lifetime. From one year to the next, the shift is smaller than the margin of error in our instruments. You have to look at the entire record, 300 years of it, with every calibration change and instrument upgrade accounted for to see the trend. Nobody ever had reason to do that before. Nobody ever asked the question. The hum was just the hum, it was background. It was the thing you subtracted to get to the data you actually cared about." "What?" He paused. Drossa asked the question, and she spent 36 hours answering it. A murmur moved through the crowd. Not applause, exactly. The people of 7 Theta were not given to public displays of emotion, but a murmur of acknowledgement, a low, rolling sound of recognition and respect that moved through the gathered bodies like wind through the grasslands, carrying with it a weight of understanding that was, in its own quiet way, more powerful than any applause could have been. Adebio let the murmur pass, then he spoke again. "I'm going to send the data to the Council. All of it, 300 years of readings, the full analysis, everything we have, they asked, and we have it, and it matters." He looked out at the faces, lit by lantern light, moved by wind, shaped by 300 years of life on this plateau. "Does anyone object?" The silence that followed was not the silence of uncertainty or hesitation. It was the silence of agreement, the particular quality of quiet that descends on a group of people who have all arrived at the same conclusion independently and who recognize in the silence itself that no words are needed to confirm what everyone already knows. No one objected. The data package that Drossa prepared was, by the standards of Council scientific communication, absurd. It was not transmitted electronically. The Outpost communication equipment could not transmit data electronically to the Council's receiving systems because the Outpost's communication equipment was not connected to the Council's receiving systems in any direct way. The only means of sending information off-planet was the monthly supply drone, which carried data cylinders in its cargo hold, physical containers that had to be loaded by hand, and that would be processed by whatever relay station the drone eventually reached. Data package was therefore a physical object, a set of data cylinders, the same type that the supply drone had been carrying for 300 years, loaded with digital files that contained the full 300-year dataset, Drossa's analysis, her conversion framework, her calibration cross-references, and a covering document that Adebio had dictated and that one of the communication technicians had typed into the Outpost's primitive word processor. The covering document was brief and direct. It identified the outpost, described the monitor network and its history, summarized Dross's findings, and noted the apparent correspondence between the 300-year gravitational resonance trend and the subspace anomaly described in the Council's emergency broadcast. It did not speculate about causes. It did not make claims beyond what the data supported. It ended with a single sentence: "We hope this is useful." The data cylinders were loaded into the supply drone on the morning of the 11th day after the first emergency broadcast. Drossa supervised the loading personally, checking each cylinder's seating and seal with the same attention she brought to every technical task, because the data inside those cylinders represented 300 years of work by people who were mostly dead, and she was not going to allow a faulty seal to be the reason their work was lost. Adebio stood beside her as the drone prepared for departure. The morning wind was strong, coming down from the mountains in gusts that carried the sharp, clean smell of mineral dust and high-altitude air. The drone systems hummed through their startup sequence, a familiar sound that had been repeated every cycle for 300 years, but that now carried a different weight, a sense that this routine departure was, for the first time, carrying something that mattered to someone beyond the plateau. "Will they read it?" Drossa asked. Adebio watched the drone's engines cycle up, the vibration in the ground beneath his feet increasing as the thrust built. "I don't know," he said. "They asked for data from everyone. They'll get data from a lot of places. Some of it will be more polished than ours. Some of it will come from people with better credentials and better equipment. But ours will be the longest record," Drossa said. It was not a question. "By centuries," Adebio said. The drone lifted off. It rose straight up, a boxy, ungraceful shape against the amber sky, its engines roaring louder as it climbed through the denser air near the surface. The wind caught it as it gained altitude, pushing it slightly south of its intended heading, and the onboard correction system adjusted, a small but visible shift in the drone's orientation that brought it back on course. Adebio watched it shrink, the boxy shape becoming a dot, the dot becoming a speck, the speck becoming a memory, until there was nothing left but the fatting sound of engines and the open sky, empty and vast and indifferent. Drossa stood beside him, watching the sky where the drone had been. Her hands were folded in front of her, still and composed, the hands of a woman who had spent 63 years maintaining instruments and who understood, better than most, that the work of sending a thing into the world was only the beginning of the work, and that what happened to it after it left your hands was beyond your control. "Whatever happens," she said, "we did the work." Adebio nodded. The wind pulled at his clothes. The grasslands moved in slow waves beyond the edge of the plateau. The twin suns climbed higher, and the light on the stones of the landing pad warmed, and somewhere far away beyond the mountains, beyond the relay networks, beyond the reach of anything the people of this plateau had ever built, a crisis was consuming a galaxy, and the answer to it was climbing toward the sky in a boxy, obsolete drone that was held together with wire and stubbornness and 300 years of uninterrupted attention. The answer was not elegant. It was not sophisticated. It was not produced by the greatest minds or the most advanced instruments or the most powerful civilizations. It was produced by farmers and technicians and water system coordinators who had spent their lives watching the ground beneath their feet and writing down what they saw. It would have to be enough, because it was all they had. The response from the council was not immediate. Adebio had not expected it to be. He had spent 51 years on a world where nothing was immediate, where every process unfolded at the pace dictated by available resources and physical constraints, where the gap between a need arising and a need being met was measured not in hours or days but in weeks, months, sometimes years. He understood that the galaxy beyond the plateau operated on different timescales, that the Council's systems, for all their complexity and power, were still systems, and systems process things in order, and the order was determined by priorities, and the priorities of a galaxy in crisis were vast and many and layered in ways that a man standing on a windy plateau could not fully imagine. But understanding did not make the waiting easier. The data cylinders had been loaded onto the supply drone 11 days ago. The drone had departed and climbed and disappeared into the sky, and Adebio had returned to his office and resumed his work and tried not to think about what was happening to the small physical containers that held 300 years of careful observation, tried not to imagine them sitting in a cargo hold somewhere, or being processed by a relay station technician who was overwhelmed by the volume of incoming data, and who might set them aside in favor of submissions that were more clearly labeled. More professionally formatted, more immediately impressive. He tried not to think about these things, and he failed because he was human, and humans, even humans who had spent 300 years learning patience, could not entirely suppress the desire to know. The days passed, the wind blew, the grass moved. The monitors hummed their quiet, continuous song, and Drossa continued her work with the same unbroken rhythm she had maintained for 63 years, calibrating and recording and maintaining because the work did not stop just because something important had been sent into the sky. If anything, she worked with greater care than before, checking and rechecking every reading, documenting every observation with a precision that bordered on the obsessive, because she understood with the clarity of someone who had just discovered that her life's work mattered in ways she had never anticipated, that the data she was recording now might be as important as the data she had already sent, that the crisis was ongoing and that every new reading added another piece to the record. Another stone to the wall. Adebio went back to the drainage trench. The blockage was still there. The mineral sediment did not care about galactic emergencies. It sat in the channel, dense and unyielding, waiting to be broken apart and removed by someone with a chisel and the willingness to use it. So Adebio climbed back into the trench and resumed the work, because the water system needed to function regardless of what was happening in subspace, and because the physical act of chiseling, repetitive and demanding, and grounded in the immediate reality of stone and sediment and effort, was a kind of anchor that kept him from drifting too far into the anxious space of speculation and waiting. He chiseled, he cleared, he moved on to the next maintenance task and the next, cycling through the water system's endless list of needs with the mechanical reliability of a man who had trained himself to find comfort in routine. And at night he went home to Essa, and they sat together in their stone house on the southern edge of the settlement, and they did not talk about the data package or the council or the crisis, because there was nothing to say that had not already been said, and because the silence between two people who have shared a life for 26 years is not an absence of communication but a form of it, a language of presence and proximity that conveys more than words could manage. Essa did not ask if he had heard anything. She knew he would tell her when there was something to tell. Instead, she wove. She sat in her chair by the window with the light of the twin suns falling across her loom and her hands moving in the precise rhythmic patterns that turned raw wool into cloth, and the sound of the loom filled the house with a soft, steady clacking that was, in its own way, as reassuring as the hum of the monitors or the wind in the grass. She was making a blanket. Not for any particular purpose or recipient, but because the work was there and her hands knew how to do it, and because the act of creating something useful and beautiful from raw materials was, for Essa, what maintaining the monitors was for Drasa and what clearing drainage trenches was for Adebjo, a way of being in the world that did not require the world to notice or approve or respond. 9 days after the drone departed, Adebjo was eating breakfast when the comm unit crackled. Not with an emergency broadcast, not with a priority signal, with a standard incoming message, the kind of routine communication that the Outpost received perhaps twice a year, usually related to schedule changes for the supply drone or updates to colonial filing requirements that did not apply to a settlement that no one filed anything about. He almost did not answer it. The message could wait. The drainage trench could not. But he answered it because he answered every message. Because that was what you did when you lived in a place where messages were rare and therefore potentially important. And because some part of him, the part that had been waiting for 9 days without admitting it, was waiting, knew. The message was brief. It was from a council routing office, a mid-level administrative node that handled the sorting and distribution of incoming data submissions. It informed the recipient, identified by the Outpost designation rather than its name, that their data submission had been received and logged. It provided a tracking reference number. It stated that the submission had been placed in a processing queue for review by the emergency research team. It did not express gratitude or interest or urgency. It was a form letter, the kind generated by automated systems to acknowledge receipt of things that the system had been designed to acknowledge, and it contained no information that indicated whether anyone had actually looked at the data or whether anyone would. Adebio read it twice, he set the comm unit down, he finished his breakfast, he went to work. The data was in the queue, that was something, it was not nothing. It meant the cylinders had reached a relay station, had been processed, had been digitized if they were not already in digital format, had been entered into the system that the emergency research team was using to manage the flood of incoming submissions. It meant the data existed in the council's systems, alongside the data from every other outpost and station and world that had responded to the broadcast. It was in the queue. It would be reviewed, eventually, maybe. He did not say any of this to anyone outside Essa. There was no point. The people of the outpost had done what they could do, the rest was out of their hands. The queue was long. The council's call for data had produced a response that overwhelmed the processing capacity of the emergency research team's administrative infrastructure within the first 48 hours. Submissions arrived from every corner of known space, a torrent of data files and sensor logs and observational records that flooded the receiving systems and created a backlog so extensive that the team's data analysts, working around the clock, could not keep up with the inflow. Thousands of submissions. Tens of thousands. Every research station with a subspace sensor, every colony with a gravitational monitor, every ship that had recorded anomalous readings in transit, Every amateur astronomer on every backwater world who had ever noticed something odd in their telescope's output and written it down in a notebook, all of them had responded to the broadcast, and all of their responses had to be received, cataloged, preliminarily screened, and assigned to the appropriate research team for detailed analysis. The screening process was designed to be efficient. Submissions were initially sorted by automated systems that assessed them against a set of criteria: the type of data provided, the duration of the observation period, the sensitivity of the instruments used, the relevance of the data to the specific phenomena under investigation. Submissions that scored highly on these criteria were fast-tracked to the research teams. Submissions that scored poorly were placed in a secondary queue for later review. A queue that, given the volume of incoming data and the limited number of analysts available to review it, might not be reached for weeks or months. The automated sorting system had been designed by Turelli information architects and was, by the standards of council bureaucratic technology, extremely sophisticated. It could evaluate a submission's potential relevance in seconds, processing metadata, scanning for keywords, comparing the submission's described parameters against the known characteristics of the subspace anomaly, and assigning a priority score that determined where the submission would land in the queue. The system had a bias. Not a deliberate bias, not a malicious bias, but a structural one, the kind that emerges inevitably from any system that is designed to optimize for certain criteria and that treats those criteria as proxies for value. The system was designed to prioritize submissions from sources with advanced instrumentation, long documented track records of scientific research, and established reputations for producing high-quality data. These criteria were reasonable. They were, in most cases, reliable predictors of data quality. A submission from a Keith Rami research station with a century-long observation record and state-of-the-art subspace sensors was, statistically, far more likely to contain useful information than a submission from a marginal colony with homemade equipment and no scientific credentials. But statistics were not certainty, and proxies were not the thing itself, and the system's bias meant that certain kinds of submissions that did not fit the expected profile of high-quality scientific data, were consistently deprioritized regardless of their actual content. A submission from a source with no institutional affiliation, no documented scientific track record, and no advanced instrumentation would receive a low priority score even if the data it contained was, in fact, the most important dataset in the entire queue. The submission from source vector 7 theta received a low priority score. The automated system assessed it in approximately 1.3 seconds. It noted that the submitting source was classified as a marginal habitat under direct council jurisdiction with no affiliated research institution, no documented history of scientific publication, and no advanced subspace instrumentation. It noted that the data described was gravitational resonance measurements rather than direct subspace readings, which placed it one step removed from the phenomenon under investigation. It noted that the submitting source's communication profile indicated a history of only routine administrative contacts with council systems, with no prior submissions of scientific data of any kind. It noted that the covering document was brief and informal, and lacked the structured formatting that characterized professional scientific communications. The system assigned the submission a priority score of 12.7 out of 100. It placed it in the secondary queue. It moved on to the next submission, of which there were approximately 14,000 remaining in the intake buffer. The submission from 7 Theta sat in the secondary queue for 6 days. During those 6 days, the zone of silence expanded by another 8 light-years, engulfing 2 more relay stations and cutting off 7 additional colony worlds from the network. The emergency research team, working in their shifts, reviewed submissions from the fast-track queue and found useful data in some and irrelevant noise in others. They refined their models. They adjusted their projections. They argued and failed and argued again. And the submission from 7 Theta waited, a small digital file in a vast electronic queue, containing 300 years of answers to questions the galaxy's greatest minds had not yet learned to ask. A junior data analyst named Ferris pulled the file at 3 in the morning. Ferris was a young Turelli, recent graduate of the Turelli Academy of Information Sciences, assigned to the Emergency Research Team's Data Processing Division as part of the massive mobilization of personnel that the crisis had triggered. He was not a scientist. He was not a subspace theorist. He was an information worker, trained in the management, organization, and preliminary assessment of large datasets, a skill set that was essential to the research team's operations, but that did not require deep domain expertise in any specific scientific field. His job was to look at submissions that had been flagged by the automated system as potentially interesting, and to make a preliminary judgment about whether they warranted escalation to the actual scientists. He had been working 18-hour shifts for 3 weeks. He was surviving on stimulants, a practice that was officially discouraged and unofficially ubiquitous among the data processing staff, and his ability to concentrate had degraded to the point where he was relying more on instinct than analysis, scanning files with a kind of weary peripheral attention that registered patterns and anomalies without fully engaging his conscious mind. It was not ideal. It was not sustainable. It was what the crisis required, and Ferris, like everyone else on the team, was doing what the crisis required. The secondary queue was empty when he checked it at 2:47 in the morning, the automated system having finally processed and sorted all of the incoming submissions. The fast-track queue was also empty, which meant there was nothing left to do until new submissions arrived, which would not happen until the next relay drone cycle, which was not for another 4 hours. Ferris could have taken a break. He could have slept, or eaten, or stared at the wall of his small, windowless workstation in the way that people who have been awake too long stare at walls. Not seeing the wall but seeing the space behind their own eyes where fatigue and stress paint their own images. Instead, he opened the secondary review queue, the holding area for submissions that had received low priority scores but that had not been formally dismissed. These were the leftovers, the submissions that the automated system had deemed unlikely to be useful, but that protocol required to be human-reviewed before being archived or discarded. There were several thousand of them. Ferris had been working through them in his spare moments for 2 weeks, skimming each one for 30 seconds to a minute before moving on, a process that was, by his own assessment, barely more rigorous than the automated sorting it was supposed to supplement. He pulled the next file, source vector 7 theta, priority score 12.7, gravitational resonance data, marginal habitat, human jurisdiction. He expected to spend 30 seconds glancing at it before moving on. He spent 4 hours reading it. The shift began with the covering document. It was short, as the automated system had noted, and informal in tone, and it lacked the structured formatting of professional scientific communication. But Ferris, reading it with the slightly altered perception that extreme fatigue sometimes produces, noticed something that the automated system had not been designed to detect. The covering document was written by someone who understood the data they were describing. Not at the level of a subspace theorist, not at the level of a Keith Rami physicist, but at the level of someone who had spent a lifetime working with a specific set of instruments and who could describe what those instruments measured with a precision that came from intimate, hands-on knowledge. The language was plain, but it was not vague. Every sentence contained specific information. There was no filler, no hedging, no padding. It was the most efficiently written document Ferris had encountered in 3 weeks of reviewing submissions, and he had reviewed submissions from some of the most prestigious research institutions in the galaxy. Then he looked at the data. The dataset was large, 300 years of readings, sampled at varying rates depending on the era, with calibration metadata that documented every instrument change, every component replacement, every modification to the measurement protocol across the entire 300-year span. The calibration metadata alone was extraordinary. Ferris had seen scientific datasets with calibration records, but never with calibration records this detailed, this continuous, this comprehensive. Most research institutions maintained calibration records for as long as the current generation of instruments had been in operation, typically a few decades at most. This dataset had calibration records that stretched back 3 centuries, documenting a chain of instrument maintenance and modification that was, in its own way, as remarkable as the data itself. And the data. Ferris was not a subspace physicist. He could not fully evaluate the scientific implications of what he was looking at, but he had been working with the emergency research team for 3 weeks, and in that time he had absorbed enough of the team's discussions and debates and analytical frameworks to recognize certain things when he saw them. He knew what the Velcora anomaly looked like in data. He knew what the frequency and acceleration curves looked like. He had seen them plotted on displays in the research team's main analysis chamber, had stared at them while scientists argued about what they meant, had absorbed their shape into his visual memory the way you absorb the shape of a face you see every day. The data from 7 theta contained the same shape, the same frequency, the same acceleration curve, not approximately, not roughly, precisely. As if someone had taken the Velcora data and stretched it backward in time, extending the 63-day observation into a 300-year record that showed not just the current surge but the entire history of the phenomenon that had produced it. But it was more than that. It was more than just a longer version of the same data. The 300-year record showed things that the 63-day record could not possibly show. It showed the origin of the signal, not its spatial origin, which remained unclear, but its temporal origin, the point in time when the frequency had first begun to deviate from what appeared to be a stable baseline. It showed the rate of acceleration across 3 centuries, revealing not a single smooth curve but a pattern of phases, long slow periods of gradual change punctuated by sharp surges, like the rhythm of a breathing thing, inhaling and exhaling over timescales so vast that no short-term observation could ever have detected them. And it showed something else. Something that Ferris almost missed because it was subtle, buried in the noise floor of the data, visible only when the entire 300-year dataset was viewed as a single continuous thread rather than as a series of discrete observations. A secondary pattern, a harmonic. A response to the primary signal that was fainter and slower and more complex, but that was undeniably present. A counterrhythm woven into the fabric of the data like a second melody in a piece of music, not competing with the main theme but complementing it, answering it, responding to it in a way that suggested intentionality, or at least pattern, at a level of complexity that no single observation could have revealed. Ferris stared at the data for a long time. The numbers and waveforms on his screen filled his vision, and the hum of the workstation's cooling system filled his ears, and the fatigue that had been pressing against the back of his eyes for 3 weeks receded, not because he was rested, but because the thing he was looking at was so compelling that his body temporarily forgot to be tired. He woke his supervisor. His supervisor was a senior data analyst named Verath, a middle-aged Turali who had been with the research team since its formation and who had earned, through weeks of unremitting effort, the right to be irritated by being woken at 4 in the morning for anything short of a confirmed breakthrough. Ferris showed him the data. Verath looked at it with the bleary, skeptical expression of someone who has been disappointed too many times by junior staff who mistook noise for signal. He looked at it for 2 minutes. His expression changed. He looked at it for 5 more minutes. He stopped looking like a man who had been woken up and started looking like a man who was very much awake. He woke the department head. The department head was a Keith Rami information scientist named Oltar, a calm, methodical individual who had been tasked with overseeing the data processing division and who had not left the research facility in 19 days. Oltar reviewed the data with the measured attention of someone who has trained themselves to resist the impulse toward premature excitement, checking the calibration metadata, verifying the conversion framework that had been used to unify the dataset, looking for the methodological flaws that would explain away the apparent significance of the findings as artifacts of poor technique or wishful thinking. He found no flaws. The calibration metadata was meticulous. The conversion framework was sound. The methodology was primitive by council standards, hand-calculated rather than algorithmically generated, but it was internally consistent and it produced results that were, within calculable margins of error, reliable. The data was real. The pattern was real. The 300-year record of a gravitational resonance signal that matched and extended the Velcora anomaly was real. And it had been produced by a marginal human colony using homemade instruments on a world that the Council's most recent inspection report, filed 212 years ago, had described as quaint, irrelevant, and structurally inadequate. Oltar woke the Emergency Council. It was the 7th hour of the morning cycle when Ithessa received the summons. She had been asleep for approximately 90 minutes, having finally concluded a 16-hour analysis session at 5 in the morning and having collapsed into the small sleeping compartment that the research facility assigned to visiting scientists, a space that was technically adequate for rest, but that was, in practice, too close to the analysis chamber to allow genuine disengagement from the work. The summons arrived as a priority alert on her personal comm device, and the words 7 Theta gravitational data appeared on the screen, and Ithessa sat up in her bunk and felt something happen in her chest that she had not felt since she was a student. A young Keith Rami just beginning her career, discovering for the first time that the universe was capable of surprising her. She dressed quickly. She did not stop for tea, which was a significant sacrifice by her standards. She walked through the corridors of the research facility at a pace that was faster than her normal stride but that she refused to classify as hurrying, because hurrying was undignified and Ithessa had invested too much of her professional reputation in the appearance of composure to abandon it now, even in circumstances that arguably warranted it. The analysis chamber was full when she arrived. Not just the usual research team, but the full emergency council, the same body that had been debating the crisis in the council chamber on the Turali homeworld, now somehow present in this relatively small room, their various forms occupying every available space, creating a density of political and scientific authority that the room's environmental systems were not designed to accommodate. The air was warm and slightly stale. The lighting was harsh. Every display surface in the chamber was active, showing the 7 Theta data in multiple formats and at multiple scales. The 300-year record spread across the walls like a landscape, a terrain of numbers and curves and patterns that filled the room with a visual density that was almost overwhelming. Ithessa looked at the data on the nearest display and did not speak for several seconds. She was reading. Not the numbers themselves, which she would need time to fully absorb, but the shape of the data, the overall contour of the 300-year record as it was plotted across the display. The rise and fall and rise again of the frequency curve that told a story that no 63-day observation could have told. The surges, she said. Athales, who was standing across the room with a display panel in front of her and an expression on her face that Ithessa had never seen before. An expression that combined recognition, astonishment, and something that might have been grief, nodded. Three of them, Athales said. The current surge is the third. The previous two occurred approximately 90 and 160 years ago based on the frequency acceleration pattern. Both were shorter in duration and smaller in magnitude than the current surge. Both were followed by extended periods of near stability during which the frequency remained essentially flat. The cycle, Ithessa said. The cycle, Athales confirmed. The room was quiet. Not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of attention. A focused, almost physical silence that pressed against the walls and the people in the room, a silence that was full of the weight of what was being understood. The implications were staggering, and they cascaded through the assembled minds like a sequence of dominoes falling, each one triggering the next. If the pattern was cyclical, then the current surge was not the beginning of a terminal collapse but a phase in an ongoing process. A phase that had occurred before and that had, in previous occurrences, resolved itself without destroying the subspace medium entirely. The Council's projection of total systemic collapse within 18 months was based on the assumption that the current acceleration would continue indefinitely. If the cycle held, the acceleration would peak and stabilize within approximately 70 days, having expanded to a maximum radius of roughly 200 light-years from its point of origin, before entering another long plateau. The crisis was real, the zone of silence was real. The relay stations that had gone dark were really dark, and the ships that had lost their FTL drives were really stranded, and the people who were cut off from the relay network were really isolated. None of that was changed by the discovery of the cycle. But the crisis was not unprecedented. It was not unique. It was not the end of interstellar civilization. It was a recurring event, a natural process operating on timescales so vast that no civilization had ever observed it across multiple cycles. And the current surge, alarming as it was within the range of behavior that the historical record, the human record, suggested was normal. But there was more. There was the harmonic. Ithessa saw it when she zoomed the display to show the fine structure of the data, the secondary pattern that Ferris had noticed in the noise floor. She saw it and she stopped moving, and she stood perfectly still in the crowded, warm, overlit room and stared at the display with an intensity that made the scientist standing next to her shift uncomfortably, as if the force of her attention were a physical pressure that was leaking outward and affecting nearby bodies. The harmonic was a response, not a random fluctuation, not an artifact. A structured, patterned, temporally correlated response to the primary signal that followed each surge with a delay of approximately 5 to 7 years, and that produced an effect that was, in the gravitational resonance data, the precise inverse of the smoothing effect, a restoration. After each surge erased topological features from the subspace medium, the harmonic response slowly, imperfectly, but measurably reconstructed them. It did not restore the medium to its original state. The restoration was partial, each cycle leaving the subspace topology slightly different from what it had been before, like a bone that heals with a slight thickening at the fracture site. But it was a restoration. It was a repair. It was evidence that the destructive process was not the only process at work, that something else was acting on the subspace medium in opposition to the smoothing, drawing the pathways back, reconnecting the threads that had been severed. Two forces, one destructive, one restorative, operating in a cycle on timescales of centuries. The implications of this were so large that Ithessa could not fully grasp them in the moment. She could hold pieces of them in her mind, fragments of understanding that floated in the space between what was known and what was suspected, but the full picture was too vast, too strange, too fundamentally different from anything in the existing framework of subspace mechanics to be assembled in real time. She would need weeks, months, years possibly to work through the theoretical implications, to develop models that could account for two opposing processes operating on the foundational medium of interstellar civilization, to understand what it meant that subspace was not a passive stage, but an active participant in some kind of cosmic process that dwarfed the concerns of every species that had ever traveled between the stars. But she did not need to fully understand it to know that it changed everything. The human data did not solve the crisis. It did not stop the zone of silence from expanding. It did not restore the relay network or free the stranded ships or reconnect the isolated worlds, but it provided something that was, in its own way, more valuable than any of those things. It provided context. It provided perspective. It transformed the crisis from an unprecedented catastrophe into a known phenomenon, and known phenomena, however dangerous, were manageable in ways that unknown phenomena were not. You could prepare for a known phenomenon. You could model it. You could plan around it. You could allocate resources efficiently because you understood the parameters of the problem. You could tell people the truth about what was happening and what to expect. And the truth, even when it was frightening, was less destructive than the void of ignorance that the Council had been struggling to fill. The zone of silence would peak in approximately 70 days. It would stabilize. The harmonic response would follow, and over a period of years, the subspace medium in the affected region would be partially restored. Relay stations would come back online. FTL travel would resume. The isolated worlds would be reconnected. It would take time. It would require effort. There would be lasting damage, regions of subspace that would never fully recover, relay routes that would need to be rerouted, trade patterns that would need to be reconfigured. But it would not be the end. It would not be the collapse of civilization. It would be a disruption, a severe and costly disruption, but a disruption with a known duration and a known resolution, and that knowledge was, at this moment in the crisis, the most valuable thing in the galaxy. And it had come from a forgotten human outpost, from handmade instruments, from handwritten logs, from 300 years of uninterrupted attention paid by people who had been told, in every way that an institution could tell a people something without saying it outright, that they did not matter. Ithessa turned away from the display and looked at the faces in the room. Turelli statesmen, Keithrami physicists, Broaden military officers, representatives of species that had been navigating the stars for millennia, that had built empires and fought wars and mapped the galaxy with a thoroughness that they had believed was essentially complete, that had looked at the marginal worlds and the backwater colonies and the forgotten outposts and seen nothing worth examining. She did not say any of what she was thinking. It was not the time. There would be time later for reflections on institutional failure and the blindness of power. Now was the time for action. "The data is reliable," she asked. Authales answered, "The calibration chain is unbroken. The conversion methodology is sound. I have identified no instrumental artifacts that could account for the observed patterns. The data is reliable." Ithessa nodded. "Then we need to get a team to 7 Theta, not in 70 days now. We need to see the instruments. We need to understand exactly how the data was collected, by whom, and under what conditions. We need to verify every aspect of this dataset with direct observation. And we need to do it before the zone of silence cuts off the region containing 7 Theta's relay route, which, based on the current expansion rate, it will do in approximately 17 days. She looked at Torvesen, the Turelli statesman, who had been standing in the back of the room with the expression of a man who was processing information faster than his diplomatic instincts could filter it. "Authorize it," she said. Torvesen did not hesitate. "Consider it authorized." The research vessel departed the Turelli homeworld within 6 hours. It was a fast ship, a Keithrami science vessel that had been retrofitted for emergency response duty, stripped of its research equipment, and loaded with fuel reserves that would have been considered an unacceptable expenditure under any other circumstances. The vessel's commanding officer, a Keithrami navigator named Thessel, had been given her orders directly by the Emergency Council. Proceed to Source Vector 7 Theta by the most direct route, burning fuel reserves as necessary to arrive before the zone of silence severed the relay corridor. The orders did not mention priority. They did not need to. The fuel expenditure alone communicated the priority more eloquently than any verbal designation could have achieved. The journey took 17 days. 17 days of continuous FTL travel through a relay network that was deteriorating around them, each jump carrying them through regions of subspace that were progressively more disturbed, the topology becoming less defined, the pathways narrowing and roughening as the zone of silence advanced. Thessel pushed the vessel hard, pushing the engines to output levels that exceeded their rated specifications, pushing the navigation systems to find routes through the increasingly chaotic subspace environment, pushing herself and her crew to maintain the pace that the mission required. They arrived at the edge of the 7 Theta system with fuel reserves so depleted that they would have been unable to make the return journey under normal power. A fact that Thessel noted in her log with the dry, factual tone that Keithrami naval officers used to describe situations that were, by any reasonable standard, insane. They descended through the atmosphere and saw the plateau. From orbit 7 Theta looked the way it had always looked to the few automated survey systems that had ever observed it, a dry, windy world with extensive grasslands, twin suns, and mountains. There were no lights visible from orbit, because the outpost's electrical generation was limited to basic needs and did not produce illumination that was visible from space. There were no orbital structures, no navigation beacons, no orbital traffic of any kind. The planet looked uninhabited from orbit, a fact that had contributed to its marginal classification, and that was, in the opinion of every member of the research vessel's crew who looked down at it through the viewport, deeply misleading. The vessel descended toward the coordinates specified in the data submission, following a trajectory that had been calculated from the information in the covering document. The landing pad appeared below them, a flat area of packed earth with faded markings that were barely visible, and beside it, the cluster of stone and timber buildings that constituted the largest human settlement on the planet, looking from the air like a small, simple, unremarkable collection of structures that could have been built by any pre-technological species on any marginal world in the galaxy. The vessel was sleek. It was advanced. It was a product of the most sophisticated spacecraft engineering capability in known space, its hull surfaces gleaming with the subtle iridescence of Turelli-derived composite materials, its engines emitting a low, smooth hum that was the acoustic signature of precisely calibrated power systems operating within optimal parameters. It looked, as it descended toward the dusty landing pad with its faded paint and its crumbling edges, like something that had arrived from a different universe entirely, a visitor from a world of clean lines and abundant resources and institutional confidence, stepping into a world of wind and stone and stubborn, unglamorous endurance. The contrast was absurd. Several members of the research crew noted this fact in their personal logs, using varying degrees of understatement to describe the experience of watching their state-of-the-art vessel touch down on a landing pad that had not been maintained to council standards in centuries. One crew member, a young Turelli engineer, wrote in her log that the pad looked as if it had been maintained by people who had been told that nobody would ever come, a description that was more accurate than she knew. Odebio Chen met them at the pad. He was wearing clean clothes. This was notable only because it was unusual. Odebio's typical attire was work clothes, the durable, stained, practical garments of a man who spent most of his time in drainage trenches and pump houses. But Essa had insisted, and Odebio had learned over 26 years of marriage that there were certain battles that were not worth fighting, and the battle over whether to wear clean clothes when meeting a delegation from the Galactic Emergency Council was one of them. He stood at the edge of the pad as the vessel's ramp extended, his hands at his sides, his posture straight but not rigid, his face composed in the expression of calm attentiveness that he wore in all public situations, an expression that was not a mask but a discipline, a deliberate modulation of his natural demeanor that allowed him to meet any situation without revealing more than he chose to reveal. Behind him, at a respectful distance, a small group of Outpost residents had gathered, drawn by the unprecedented sight of a spacecraft that was not the supply drone landing on the pad. Drassa was among them. So were several of the water system technicians, a few of the agricultural workers, and a number of children who had been pulled from their lessons by the commotion and who were staring at the vessel with expressions of unself-conscious wonder that the adults in the group were too polite to display, but that many of them felt. The ramp touched the pad, the research team emerged. Ithessa came first. She was smaller than Odebio had expected, a compact Keithrami with the pale, almost translucent skin that was characteristic of her species and the dark, deep-set eyes that gave Keithrami faces their characteristic intensity. She moved with the deliberate grace of someone who is accustomed to being in environments where every movement is observed and evaluated, and her gaze found Odebio's face across the distance between the ramp and the edge of the pad, and held it with a focus that was not aggressive, but that was thoroughly unavoidable. Behind her came Athales. The physicist was older than Ithessa, her fur, the fine, dense covering that served Keithrami as both insulation and sensory organ, showing the gray streaks of age, and her movements were less graceful than Ithessa's, carrying the slightly stiff quality of someone whose body had been subjected to too many hours of sedentary work and not enough hours of rest. But her eyes, when they swept across the landing pad and the buildings beyond it and the grasslands stretching to the horizon, were sharp and hungry, and alive with the particular quality of attention that a scientist brings to a new environment. An attention that is not merely looking but analyzing, cataloging, building a mental model of what they are seeing that will later be compared against what they expected to see. Behind them came the rest of the team, a mix of Keithrami and Turelli scientists and technicians, perhaps a dozen in all, each carrying equipment cases or personal effects, each displaying the slightly dazed expression of people who had just completed a 17-day emergency journey through a deteriorating subspace environment, and who had not yet fully transitioned from the urgency of travel to the different kind of urgency that awaited them at their destination. Ithessa reached the edge of the ramp and stopped. She was standing perhaps 2 meters from Odebio, close enough that he could see the individual fibers of her fur and the fine lines around her eyes that were the marks of exhaustion and concentration. She looked at him for a moment, and he looked at her, and neither of them spoke, because there was a brief suspended instant in which two beings from radically different worlds, who had arrived at this moment by such different paths, recognized in each other a quality that transcended their differences. The quality of someone who is doing the most important work they have ever done and who knows it. Then Ithessa spoke, and her voice, carried across the wind that was pulling at both their clothes, was direct and unadorned in a way that Adebyo recognized and appreciated. Mayor Chen, I am Ithessa, I need to see your instruments. Adebyo nodded. He had expected something more formal, a greeting and introduction, an exchange of diplomatic pleasantries, but he found that he preferred this. It was efficient. It was honest. It was the way people on 7 Theta spoke to each other when the work was pressing and the time was short. Not the data, Ithessa added before he could respond. The instruments themselves, I have read the data. I have spent 17 days reading your data. Now I need to see what produced it. Adebyo turned and led her toward the monitor station. He took her to the first monitor station, the squat stone building on the eastern edge of the plateau that Drasa had occupied for 50 years. The walk from the landing pad to the station took approximately 8 minutes, during which Ithessa said nothing and looked at everything. She looked at the buildings they passed, at their stone walls and timber frames and recycled hull plating. She looked at the paths between the buildings, packed earth worn smooth by generations of foot traffic. She looked at the people who paused in their work to watch them pass, their faces showing curiosity and a guarded friendliness that was not hostility but was not quite welcome either. The expression of people who were accustomed to being overlooked and who were not yet sure how to feel about being noticed. She looked at the grasslands beyond the settlement, the amber expanse moving in the wind under the twin suns, and she saw, with the eyes of a scientist who had spent her career in the controlled environments of research stations and council facilities, a world that was not controlled, not optimized, not designed, but that was alive in a way that designed environments were not, alive with the organic, unplanned, accumulated complexity of a place that had been shaped by its inhabitants rather than by its architects. The monitor station was smaller than she had expected. Not just small by the standards of a council research facility, which would have been an unfair comparison, but small by any standard, a single room perhaps 6 meters by 8, built of local stone with a timber roof that had been repaired multiple times, and that showed the uneven texture of patches and replacements that did not quite match the original material. The door was heavy wood, hand-carved, and it scraped slightly against the stone floor when Adebyo opened it, a sound that was immediately absorbed by the interior's dense clutter. Inside, the equipment was old. Some components were literally 200 years old, carefully maintained and replaced only when absolutely necessary, their original metal surfaces worn smooth by decades of handling, their fasteners hand-tightened and retightened so many times that the screw heads had lost their original shapes and had been recut with files and hand tools to maintain their grip. Other components were newer, replacements and upgrades that had been fabricated locally using whatever materials were available, and the interface between old and new was visible in the slight mismatches of color and texture and proportion that marked the points where one generation's work met another's. Ithessa stood in the doorway for a long time. She did not move, she did not touch anything. She stood and looked, her dark eyes moving across the room in a slow, systematic sweep that took in every surface, every component, every tool, every piece of paper on every shelf. She was not cataloging, she was absorbing. She was allowing the reality of this place to impress itself upon her senses without the filter of analysis, letting the raw data of visual and tactile and olfactory experience accumulate before she began to process it. Drasa was inside, sitting at the primary console as she always was, performing a calibration check with the unhurried precision that defined her work. She did not stand when Ithessa entered. She did not greet her. She completed the calibration, checked the result against the expected values, nodded to herself, and then turned to look at the Keithrami scientist with an expression that was not hostile and not welcoming, but that was unmistakably the expression of a person who was in her space and who was prepared to be courteous, but who was not prepared to be intimidated. Ithessa crossed the room and looked at the console. She looked at the displays, the analog gauges with their hand-painted calibration marks, the digital readouts with their locally fabricated housings, the interface panels with their hand-wired connections. She leaned close to one of the analog gauges, bringing her face within centimeters of its surface, and studied the calibration marks with an intensity that made Drasa, watching her, raise one eyebrow slightly. "This is brilliant," Ithessa said quietly. It was not a compliment. It was an observation, a statement of fact delivered in the same flat, precise tone that Ithessa used for all of her professional communications. But it carried a weight that a more effusive expression of admiration could not have achieved, because it came from someone who understood at the deepest level of her professional being what she was looking at. The gauge was a hand-built gravitational resonance detector. Its sensor was a tuned mass oscillator, a concept that was well understood in subspace physics, but that was typically implemented using precision manufactured components and controlled by sophisticated electronic systems. This gauge's sensor had been built by hand, using locally smelted metal for the mass and locally grown fiber for the suspension, and its output was read not by an electronic system, but by an optical mechanism that used mirrors and lenses ground from local crystal to amplify the mass's microscopic oscillations into visible deflections on the gauge's face. The calibration marks on the gauge had been painted by hand, each one placed at a position determined by a reference standard that was itself hand-built, and that had been maintained and recalibrated across 3 centuries with a care that was, by any objective measure, extraordinary. The gauge was not precise by council standards. It could not detect the minute fluctuations that a Keith-Rami research instrument could detect, but it was precise enough for what it needed to do, which was to measure gravitational resonance in the local environment with sufficient accuracy to identify patterns over time. And it had been doing this, or something like it, for 300 years, with a consistency and continuity that no council instrument could match, because council instruments were replaced every few decades when they became obsolete, and each replacement introduced a discontinuity in the data record that could only be bridged by cross-calibration, and cross-calibration introduced uncertainty, and uncertainty accumulated over time. And the result was that no council research institution in the galaxy possessed a continuous, unbroken dataset of any kind that spanned 3 centuries. The humans on 7 Theta possessed such a dataset, not because they were brilliant, though there was a kind of brilliance in what they had done, but because they had never replaced their instruments. They had maintained them, they had repaired them. They had improved them incrementally, generation by generation, adding new components alongside old ones, extending the capability of the system without ever breaking the chain of continuity that connected the current readings to the first readings taken 300 years ago. They had done this not because they understood the scientific value of continuous data, because they had not known that the data would ever be valuable to anyone outside the outpost. They had done it because replacing the instruments would have required resources they did not have, and because the instruments they had were working, and because the principle of maintaining what you had rather than replacing it with something new was so deeply embedded in the culture of the outpost that it functioned as an unconscious axiom, a rule that was followed not because it had been articulated, but because it had never occurred to anyone to question it. Adebio shook his head. It's simple, we just needed to know when storms were coming. Simple and brilliant are not opposites, Ithessa said. She ran her fingers over the sensor housing that had been machined by hand from local iron ore, feeling the texture of the metal, the slight irregularities that told of a process that was guided by hand and eye rather than by automated precision. The metal was warm from the sun that had been shining on the building's roof, and it carried the faint, mineral smell of the iron ore from which it had been smelted, a smell that Ithessa had never encountered in any research facility she had ever visited. She turned to Drassa. Your calibration reference standard, the one you use to maintain consistency across the instrument chain. May I see it? Drassa looked at her for a moment, her expression unreadable, and then she stood and walked to a shelf at the back of the room. She removed a cloth-wrapped object from the shelf, unwrapped it with the careful deliberation of someone handling something precious, and placed it on the console in front of Ithessa. It was a metal cylinder, approximately 20 centimeters long and 5 centimeters in diameter, machined from a single piece of a dense, dark metal that Ithessa did not immediately recognize. Its surface was smooth but not polished, showing the faint, directional marks of a hand machining process that had been performed with skill and patience and without the benefit of powered tools. At one end, a series of precisely aligned markings had been etched into the metal, a graduated scale that corresponded to the gravitational resonance frequencies that the monitor network measured. This is the original reference, Drassa said. It was made by the first technician, the one who built the first monitors. His name was Park. He made it from a meteorite fragment that was found in the northern mountains. The metal is not native to this planet. It has a gravitational resonance signature that is stable and distinct, and that does not match any local geological source. Park identified it as a suitable reference standard because it was anomalous, because it stood out from the background in a way that could be reliably measured. Ithessa stared at the cylinder, a meteorite fragment, hand-machined by a settler on a forgotten world 300 years ago, using tools salvaged from a transport vessel to create a reference standard for a measurement system that he could not have known would still be in use 3 centuries later. How has it been maintained? She asked. It hasn't been maintained, Drassa said. It hasn't needed to be. The meteorite metal is stable. Its resonance signature has not changed in 300 years. We check it against the monitors every calibration cycle to verify that the monitors are still reading it correctly, but the reference itself has never required correction. A meteorite fragment, sitting in a stone building on a windy plateau, providing a stable gravitational reference standard for 300 years without degradation or drift. Ithessa did not know what metal it was. She suspected that the Keithrami metallurgical databases might contain an entry that matched its properties, but she was not certain, because the databases were extensive but not exhaustive, and the universe was large, and meteorites came from places that were not always well represented in council catalogs. But that was a question for later. The immediate question was the one that had brought her across the galaxy, and the answer to that question was here, in this room, in these instruments, in this hand-machined cylinder of alien metal that a man named Park had shaped 300 years ago because he needed a stable reference, and the universe had provided one in the form of a rock that had fallen from the sky. She looked at Adebio. Your people built this to survive, and in surviving they did something no research station in the galaxy has done. They watched the same sky uninterrupted for 300 years. Over the following weeks, the research team worked alongside the Outpost technicians. The team set up temporary workstations in and around the monitor stations, connecting their advanced analytical equipment to the Outpost instruments, running parallel measurements to verify the accuracy of the historical data, conducting detailed interviews with the technicians to document the methodology and institutional knowledge that had produced and maintained the record. The integration was not seamless. The research team's equipment was designed for different environments, different power systems, different data formats. Adapting it to work with the Outpost instruments required creative problem-solving, and in several cases, the fabrication of custom interface components using local materials and the Outpost's limited machining capabilities. A young Turelli technician named Sorrel, who had been assigned to the interface adaptation task, spent 3 days working with one of the Outpost's metalworkers to create a coupling that would connect a Turelli spectral analyzer to one of the original hand-built sensors. And the process was, by Sorrel's own subsequent account, the most frustrating and educational experience of his professional life. The metalworker, a woman named Temba who had been forging tools and components for the Outpost for 40 years, did not understand the theoretical principles behind the spectral analyzer's operation. But she understood metal, understood its properties and its behavior with an intimacy that no amount of theoretical training could match, and she suggested modifications to the coupling design that Sorrel would never have conceived of, but that solved problems he had not known how to approach. This dynamic repeated itself throughout the research team's engagement with the Outpost. The Council scientists had knowledge that the Outpost people lacked. The Outpost people had knowledge that the Council scientists lacked. The knowledge was different in kind, not in value. It was the difference between understanding the theory of a thing and understanding the practice of a thing, between knowing why a system worked and knowing how to keep it working when the theory failed and the components broke and the environment refused to cooperate. Both kinds of knowledge were necessary. Neither was sufficient alone. The humans, for their part, were not intimidated by the Keithrami scientists or the Turelli engineers. They had been maintaining these systems for generations. They knew the data better than anyone. They knew the instruments better than anyone. They knew the quirks and peculiarities of each sensor, each cable, each calibration reference, each component in the network, with a depth of familiarity that no amount of advanced training could replicate in a few weeks. When a young Turelli technician suggested recalibrating the monitor array to Council standards, a suggestion that was entirely reasonable from the perspective of someone who had been trained to work within standardized frameworks, Drossa listened politely and then explained, in the patient, precise tone of someone explaining rain to a child, why that would destroy the baseline consistency that made the data valuable in the first place. The calibration standards used by the Outpost were not Council standards. They were local standards, derived from the meteorite reference that Park had created 300 years ago and maintained in an unbroken chain from his day to this one. Every calibration performed on every instrument in the network was traceable to that reference, every reading grounded in the same foundational standard, creating a consistency that spanned 3 centuries. If the instruments were recalibrated to Council standards, the new readings would be consistent with other Council standard instruments, but inconsistent with the historical record, because the historical record was based on a different reference. The 300-year dataset would become 2 datasets, a pre-recalibration dataset and a post-recalibration dataset, with a discontinuity between them that could not be fully bridged because the relationship between the 2 reference standards could not be determined with sufficient precision to preserve the continuity of the trend. The Turelli technician looked to Ithessa for support. Ithessa nodded at Drossa. "She's right," Ithessa said. The technician accepted this with the slightly wounded expression of someone who has been corrected but who recognizes, upon reflection, that the correction was justified. He did not suggest recalibrating the monitors again. The outpost became, overnight, the most important piece of real estate in the galaxy, not because of its resources, which were negligible, not because of its location, which was remote, not because of its strategic value, which was non-existent, but because of its records. Because of 300 years of quiet, unglamorous, unbroken attention, preserved in handwritten logs and hand-calculated conversion tables, and a hand-machined meteorite reference standard that had not drifted in 3 centuries. The Council voted to establish a permanent research station on 7 Theta. The vote was unanimous, which was remarkable given that the Council had not held a unanimous vote on any substantive matter since the ratification of the peace settlement that ended the Fracture Wars. The unanimity was driven not by agreement about the scientific value of the station, which was obvious and uncontested, but by a more complex and less comfortable motivation. The recognition that the Council's failure to pay attention to 7 Theta for 300 years had nearly resulted in a catastrophic misjudgment of the crisis, and that establishing a permanent presence on the world was, in addition to its scientific justification, an act of institutional self-correction that was necessary for the Council's credibility. Debio reviewed the proposal. It was a lengthy document, written in the dense, qualified language of Council bureaucracy, that described the planned station's facilities, staffing, operational parameters, and governance structure. It was in many ways a well-crafted piece of institutional planning, thoughtful and thorough, and designed to address the practical challenges of establishing a permanent research presence on a world with limited infrastructure and no existing connection to Council supply networks. Adebio accepted the proposal on 3 conditions. The first condition was that the station be built by the Outpost's own construction crews, using local materials where possible. This was not nostalgia or pride, though both played a role. It was practical. The Outpost construction crews knew the local materials, the local conditions, and the local building techniques that had been developed over 3 centuries to produce structures that could withstand the wind, the mineral storms, and the particular stresses of life on the plateau. A building constructed by an outside crew using off-world techniques and materials might look more impressive, but it would be less durable, less adapted to the environment, and less maintainable by the people who would have to maintain it after the construction crews left. The second condition was that the human technicians remain in charge of the monitor network. The network was their creation. They understood it in ways that no outside scientist could replicate. Bringing in external operators would introduce exactly the kind of discontinuity that had made the data valuable in the first place, breaking the chain of continuity that connected the current readings to the 300-year record. The Council scientists could work alongside the technicians, could study the network and learn from it, could propose improvements and modifications that the technicians could evaluate and implement, but the authority to operate and maintain the network would remain with the people who had built it. The third condition was not stated in writing. It was understood. It was the condition that underlay the other 2, the unspoken foundation on which the entire negotiation rested. The outpost was not being absorbed into the Council's institutional structure. It was not being upgraded or modernized or brought into compliance with Council standards. It was being recognized as it was for what it was, and the research station would exist alongside it, not above it, not replacing it, but adjacent to it, a neighbor rather than an overseer. The Council agreed to every condition. 61 days after Ithas's arrival, the surge peaked. It happened exactly as the human data had predicted. The expansion rate of the zone of silence, which had been decelerating gradually over the preceding weeks as the acceleration curve approached its inflection point, dropped to 0 on a Tuesday, or what the Outpost calendar system identified as the equivalent of a Tuesday, a designation that had been maintained for 300 years out of habit more than any astronomical necessity. The boundary of the affected region stopped moving. It held. It began very slowly to contract, not in the dramatic fashion of a reversal, but in the tentative, uncertain manner of a process that was beginning, but was not yet confident of its own continuation. Relay stations on the edge of the zone began flickering back to life. Weakly at first, their signals degraded and intermittent, but strengthening over the following days as the subspace topology in their vicinity began the slow process of restoration that the harmonic pattern in the human data had predicted. Ships cautiously tested their FTL drives and found them functional, though reduced in range and efficiency. The subspace pathways through which they traveled still rough and imperfect, but navigable in a way that they had not been during the peak of the surge. Navigation systems that had been rendered unreliable by the smoothing of subspace reference points began recalibrating themselves against the partially restored topology, their automated correction algorithms producing results that were approximate but usable. Engineers estimated full restoration of the affected region within a year. Some relay stations would need to be replaced entirely, their hardware having been damaged by the stress of operating in a degraded subspace environment. Some trade routes would need to be rerouted permanently, the old pathways having been altered by the restoration process in ways that made them less efficient than before. Some colony worlds that had been isolated during the surge would take months to fully reintegrate into the relay network, their local economies and supply chains having adapted to isolation in ways that would need to be unwound. But the galaxy was breathing again. The connections were coming back. The silence was ending. The galaxy breathed, and on 7 Theta the monitors hummed their quiet, continuous song and Drossa recorded the data. And the harmonic response that she had been tracking for 300 years began its slow, patient work of drawing the pathways back, just as it had done before, just as it would do again. The restorative rhythm that answered the destructive one in a cycle that was older than any civilization, and that would continue long after every civilization that had ever observed it had turned to dust. The formal signing ceremony took place on a morning when the wind was gentle, a rare respite from the plateau's usual bluster, and the twin suns hung low in the eastern sky, casting long shadows across the central square that had been cleared and for the first time in the outpost history decorated. Not lavishly. Not in the style of council's ceremonial spaces with their banners and holographic displays and carefully orchestrated aesthetic programs, but simply with arrangements of the native grasses that grew on the plateau, bundled and tied with wool thread and placed along the edges of the square in clusters that caught the light and moved gently in the reduced wind, creating a border of amber and gold that framed the gathering in a way that was not grand, but that was, in its quiet way, beautiful. A wooden platform had been erected at one end of the square, sturdier than the usual platform, built for the occasion by the Outpost construction crews with the same care and competence they brought to every building task. On the platform, a table had been placed, and on the table, a document, the formal declaration that elevated source vector 7 Theta from a forgotten gray dot on a star chart to a designated preserve of scientific and historical significance, the first human-held world to receive such a designation. Adebio stood beside representatives of 7 species, Turelli, Keithrami, Brodden, and 4 others whose names and appearances were less familiar to the people of the outpost but whose presence communicated the breadth and seriousness of the occasion. The representatives wore their formal diplomatic attire, garments of silk and metal and bioluminescent fabric that had been designed to convey authority and cultural identity in the visually complex environment of council's ceremonial spaces. Adebio wore clean clothes. The same clean clothes Essa had insisted upon for the landing, freshly laundered, their fit slightly imperfect because Adebio's body was a working body, shaped by physical labor in ways that off-world tailoring did not anticipate. The contrast between Adebio and the diplomatic representatives was stark, and it was noticed, and it was discussed later in the reports and analyses and commentaries that the ceremony generated across the galaxy. Some commentators described it as a symbol of the gap between the Council's wealth and the outpost's poverty. Others described it as a reminder that the most valuable thing on this world was not produced by wealth but by persistence. A very few, described it as something closer to an embarrassment, an illustration of the fact that the beings who had saved the galaxy from a catastrophic misjudgment were standing beside the beings who had made the misjudgment, and that the saving had been done in work clothes while the misjudging had been done in silk. Adebio did not think about any of this. He stood on the platform and listened as the declaration was read aloud by a Turelli ceremonial officer, whose voice carried the measured cadence of someone trained to make bureaucratic language sound dignified. The declaration described in extensive detail the historical, scientific, and cultural significance of 7 Theta, the uniqueness of its continuous data record, the importance of its contribution to the crisis response, and the Council's commitment to preserving and supporting the outpost's ongoing work. It was a good document. It said the right things. Adebio appreciated the effort that had gone into it, because he understood, from his limited experience with institutional communication, how much work was required to produce a document that said the right things in the right order with the right level of formality and the right degree of sincerity. When the reading was complete, Adebio was asked to sign. He did so with a simple pen, a writing instrument that had been provided by the outpost's administrative staff, a plain, functional pen that was not ceremonial in any way. His signature was neat and unremarkable, the signature of a man who signed things occasionally and did not attach particular importance to the act. The 7 representatives signed after him, their signatures more elaborate, some of them involving biometric components or cultural markings that went beyond the merely written. Holographic recording devices captured the moment from multiple angles. The images would be transmitted across the relay network, now partially restored to every corner of known space. They would appear in news feeds, historical archives, and educational materials for generations to come. They would be analyzed, interpreted, and reinterpreted by scholars and commentators who would find in them whatever meanings they were predisposed to find. But the image that would persist, the one that would be reproduced and referenced and remembered long after the specific details of the ceremony had faded, was the image of Adebio Chen standing beside 7 formally attired diplomatic representatives in clean but ordinary clothes. His face composed, his posture straight, his hands visible at his sides in the holographic frame, showing the permanent calluses of 3 decades of mechanical work. Afterward, as the dignitaries posed for additional recordings, and the research crew prepared a reception that was slightly too formal for the setting, Adebio slipped away. He did this not dramatically, not with a gesture that would draw attention, but with the quiet, practiced ease of someone who had spent a lifetime knowing when to be present and when to withdraw, and who understood that the ceremony was over and the work that mattered was not the work of signing documents, but the work that continued regardless of whether anyone was watching. He walked to the edge of the plateau. The amber grass stretched to the horizon under the twin suns. The wind, gentler than usual but still present, carried the smell of soil and growing things, the dry, sweet, faintly herbal scent that saturated everything on this world and that the people who lived here had stopped noticing 300 years ago. The mountains stood on the northern horizon, their peaks catching the light, their weathered silhouettes unchanged since the day the first transport vessels had descended, and Odora had spoken the word that meant the place where the grass sings. The grass was singing now. A low, whispering sound, the sound of countless blades moving against each other in the wind, a sound so constant and so pervasive that it functioned as silence's opposite number, not absence but presence, not emptiness but fullness. A sound that contained within it the entire history of this place and the people who had lived on it. Drasa found him there. She was holding a cup of tea, as she always was, the local blend brewed strong and slightly bitter, the steam rising from the surface and catching the light in small, fleeting wisps that dissolved into the air almost as soon as they formed. She stood beside him in silence for a moment, 2 people looking out at a landscape that neither of them needed to describe because they both knew it with the intimacy of a lifetime, and then she spoke. "They want to name the planet after you." Adebio made a face. Not a dramatic face, not a face of outrage or indignation, but a small, involuntary expression of distaste, the kind of face a person makes when offered food they do not want to eat. "I told them no," Drasa said. Adebio looked at her. Drasa's face was, as usual, unreadable, but there was something in the set of her mouth that might have been satisfaction. The quiet, internal satisfaction of someone who had performed a small act of defiance on behalf of someone else, and who had no intention of making a fuss about it. "What name?" Adebio asked. Drasa took a sip of her tea. She held the cup in both hands, the way she always held it, cradling it against the weathered skin of her palms, the warmth of the liquid seeping into the calluses that she shared with every adult on this plateau. She looked out over the grasslands, and the twin suns caught the white of her hair and turned it to a pale gold that was almost the same color as the grass. And for a moment she looked like a part of the landscape herself, a figure made of stone and wind and light, as rooted in this place as the mountains on the horizon. "Home," she said. Adebio smiled. It was a small smile barely visible, the kind of smile that does not change the expression of the face so much as soften it, relaxing the muscles around the eyes and the mouth by a degree that only someone standing very close would notice. But it was genuine, and it was deep, and it came from a place in him that was older than language, a place where the things that mattered were not names or designations or declarations, but the simple, irreducible fact of belonging to a place and to the people who shared it with you. It was the same word his grandmother had used, and her grandmother before her. 300 years of people standing on this windy plateau, looking out at the amber grass and calling it exactly what it was. Not a designation, not a classification, not a label in a database maintained by an institution that had forgotten they existed. A word that meant what it meant because the people who spoke it meant it. And the meaning was not in the syllables but in the speaking, in the act of standing here on this rock in this wind, and saying this is ours and we are here. The galaxy had needed them once, it might need them again. The cycle was real, and it would continue, and the surges would come again, and the zone of silence would expand again, and the relay networks would fail again. And when that happened, the galaxy would need to know what the human data could tell it, would need the 300-year record and the counting record that would grow beyond 300 years. would need the monitors and the technicians and the hand-machined meteorite reference standard that had not drifted in 3 centuries, and that would not drift in 3 more. And they would be here, as they had always been, watching the sky, keeping records, making things a little better than they were before. Not because anyone asked them to, not because anyone noticed, not because anyone thanked them, but because the work was worth doing. And they were the ones there to do it. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of the grasslands toward them in a warm amber wave, and the grass bent and swayed in the new direction. And the twin suns climbed higher, and the light on the plateau warmed, and somewhere behind them in the square the dignitaries were finishing their receptions, and the researchers were packing their equipment, and the outpost was preparing to return to the rhythms of daily life that had sustained it for 3 centuries, and that would sustain it for centuries more. The quiet, patient, unglamorous rhythms of people who had learned that the most important things in the universe are not the things that are noticed, but the things that continue unnoticed until the day they are needed. And then they are there, steady and solid and real, like a rock in a sea of grass, like a heartbeat in the fabric of space, like a song that has been singing for 300 years and has not yet finished. Drasa finished her tea. She set the cup down on a flat stone at the edge of the plateau, a stone that had been worn smooth by wind and weather and that had probably served as a shelf or a table or a seat for countless people over countless years. And she turned and walked back toward the settlement, her short, slow, precise steps carrying her across the grass with the unhurried confidence of someone who had walked this path 10,000 times and who would walk it 10,000 more. Adebio watched her go, then he turned back to the grasslands. The wind was in his face. The light was warm on his skin, the grass was singing. He stood there for a long time. Then he went back to work.